Sports are a multi-billion-dollar industry, commanding their own television networks, smart apps, clothing line endorsements, and even their own dedicated majors and universities. But what is largely a spectator pastime for most today, sports in the past were much more local community activities that one might take part in as an informal gathering, or going back to more ancient times, as part of a tribalistic ritual based on their ultimate origins in warfare, hand-to-hand combat, and hunting. The very term athlete has taken on very materialistic meaning in the age of multi-million-dollar player contracts, whereas it has roots in the Hellenic word prize seeker, awarded only to those whose acts of courage, bravery, and heroism credit them with honor. How much the society has advanced, and in many ways declined, can be traced to what degree sports are regarded as heroic to that of merely spectacle.
Well, I'm not a crook. I've earned everything I've got.
A military-industrial complex.
A new world order.
But we are here to destroy the control over the industry of other people.
I did not trade arms for hostages.
It's been time to be a leader.
На полный разгром гнусных захватчиков.
Myth20c podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Myth of the 20th Century. Today we have a very special guest, James LaFond. We're going to be talking about the myth and mystery of sports in America and in the broader world, and as it connects to our historical roots as well. So James, welcome to the show. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, and let me introduce my co-hosts. I'm Adam, but I'm also joined by Hans.
Hey, everyone.
And last but not least, Alex.
Hello.
So we just kind of wanted to have a free-form conversation about sports. I think most of us on the show are a little bit like a lot of our generation, not super attuned with the previous generations in viewing sports as the American pastime. Part of it may have something to do with video games just being invented when we were sort of growing up, but I just don't remember a lot of my youth really revolving around sports. I did play them, and I think everybody here did, but it just wasn't like, if you guys ever seen that movie, The Sandlot, where everybody just all they thought about all day was just going to the ball field.
Yeah.
And my father was like that, actually, now that I think about it, because that was what people did. So I think that's part of the disconnect for us. James, you're a little bit older. I wonder how you feel about sports, and what do you think about us saying, we're not as into it as maybe some of the other generations were?
It shows that there's a chance. There's an opportunity for the human race to wake up here, as exemplified by people in your generation seeing sports as something that's not all good all the time, especially as a spectacle.
James and I actually almost came up with the same decomposition of what's going on with sports. I had a three-way decomposition James has a four-component model of primal, tribal, ritual, and spectacle. I thought that was a great way to frame sports because it's such a complicated complex of ideas and events going on with it when we talk about sports in America.
I came up with that when I was doing my reading at the Peabody for 3 years. I spent 36 hours a week reading at a library that's no longer open, that's held by Johns Hopkins University, and I was reading ancients and early English literature, and I had to find a way to frame what I was finding because the sports models that had been provided to me through boxing writers' encyclopedic sources were totally inadequate.
What was the decomposition model you had, Alex?
Oh, it was definitely I don't remember the terms that I used, but narrative, spectacle, and what was the other one? It wasn't as good as James.
Okay. I've got James's. The first thing you said was primal. Next was tribal, then ritual, then spectacle. I found the first three to be the most compelling for me, and the most more sort of like interesting takes on sports. What I would summarize primal as, and please expand on this, James, is all sports come from the hunt with regard to being primal. So maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yes, you'll look at any sport and you'll find one or both elements of aiming or chasing. In our later date, you also find elements of gathering. These point accumulation sports have only come into being at the point in history when women have been assembled as spectators alongside men. And that's so that the gathering things, even including that in something like baseball, you have an obsession with the gathering aspect. It reflects the feminization of the sport. If we could look at the spectacle as the end of the road, that's the political, that's the co-opting, the hijacking of the other elements of sport for a political purpose. And but yeah, there's a primal attraction within all of us to actions that individual athletes do, and it goes back to our design or our evolution, whichever you buy into.
I think that's interesting how you just sort of made me realize, and maybe this was your intent, maybe it wasn't, but it seems like this is kind of an evolution of not just sports, but also as civilization becomes more civilized, for lack of a better phrase, it's less barbaric, and so things get more orderly and more controlled, more predictable. And so you start with primal, where it's really just about practical things, like you're actually going out and getting resources. When it then becomes slightly larger, it's tribal, and then these rituals develop around that, and then it's finally a spectacle when you're in the Colosseum, and it's really this giant city.
Well, I see the tribal. Well, James hasn't really told us yet what tribal means, but when I look at that word, I'm thinking of like a social aspect or a narrative aspect, the way that you can tell stories about certain teams, like in the NFL, for example, over a season. So you can say, like, I don't know, like what's a storied team, like the 2000 Baltimore Ravens, who had that really good defense. Was that?
Yes.
Was that
yes. So this is our surrogate tribe. The NFL has provided us with a surrogate tribe since we don't have a tribe of our own. But I named them, so they're end up used as for this surrogate tribal function down the road. But initially, these sports, these ball sports, are things that tribal level societies, pre-state societies, will compete in, and they'll continue to compete in these events once they've been gathered into a state with this village against that village. Polo is an example. Most of them would have begun fighting over a dead animal. There's a sport in Afghanistan and Central Asia where these guys on horseback fight over this dead goat.
I think Rambo played that in Rambo 3, if I'm not mistaken.
There was a much better one with Omar Sharif in it where the sport's actually shown for what it was. But yeah, so that you got a clip of it there. Your first ball sport was probably called something like speed skull, or grab the head. It was most likely the fact that we have so many ball sports and these things come about in this context probably means that these originally played with trophy heads, these sports way back when.
Are you familiar with the Aztec rituals where they would fight to the death over multiple days? My understanding is very, very vague, but it was very brutal from what I know.
We had two different sports that were that I'm referencing right here. The Mayans and other Middle American people had a ball sport where you're not allowed to handle it with your hand. You could hit it off of any other part of your body, and you had to knock this rubber ball through this stone ring. and the losing team got executed, or their team captain got executed, depending on how extreme this was. So they're playing for keeps. They're playing before the gods. This is actually very similar in its ritual context to individual Aryan rites of the ancient Hellenistic world. And the other thing that the Aztecs did, and this is something that the Aztecs specifically did, is if you were a notable warrior and you were captured, they would tether you to a stone. You would have a large stone anchoring a cord that was tethered to your ankle, and they would give you a wooden sword that was edged with feathers, and then you would have to fight 4 enemies at the same time who had wooden swords edged with glass, with volcanic glass, obsidian. And if you won, you were not sacrificed.
Now,
good luck with that.
Who had to play in this game? I mean, it seems like a pretty poor return.
These were the captive would actually fight captors. So you would have 4 warriors fighting a captive warrior in this thing, and this was a highly ritualistic type of asymmetrical dueling, and to support it, the Aztecs had a stick fighting tradition that focused on breaking legs, and it was done with pine sticks that were about 3 feet long. I fought with pine sticks about 3 feet long, and I stopped doing it because we didn't want to break any legs. So I think it was accurately depicted by the historian I read as a leg-breaking sport.
James, do you have any particular thoughts about the funeral games depicted in the Iliad for Patroclus? I've been reading the Iliad lately.
Yes.
I'm obsessed with it.
I actually used that for the basis of one of my books, All Power Fighting, which still isn't in print yet, but it's been out as an ebook. That gives you the whole. That's the whole athletic curriculum, and athletic meant prize seeker. Mm-hmm. Our attribution, our use of the word athletes and athletics and sports, they're all way off, and they're all anachronistic. We'll go over that later, but athlete meant prize seeker. And you're seeking a prize before the god. You're being judged by the god, and you're being supervised by the person who's making this action of sacrifice to the deity, which, in my understanding, were largely ancestral deities. If we go back, the first depiction of war I've been able to find is from 20,000 years ago, around the Pyrenees, and the first depiction of sport, of unarmed combat sports, of wrestling, is from the same period in the same place. So once you have, you obviously have to have some kind of combative ritual to sustain combatants that are going to fight to the death against enemies. But in a really small society, it cannot be lethal or even maiming. So wrestling has been the choice. All societies that I've studied have wrestling traditions at their root. Most of them have dueling traditions that are at some point abandoned or co-opted. What was unique about Aryan or Indo-European societies is that they were the first, by a long shot, and perhaps the only societies that developed boxing. And it was alongside these other traditions that are shown in the funeral games for Patroclus. And boxing comes about only and immediately after the introduction of the war chariot by Indo-European people. And it's obviously a compromise between the duel and wrestling. When you look at it mechanically, you look at the way it evolves, and if you look at it as a preparatory ritual, it's partway between wrestling and dueling. So it's something highly practical, developed by people that their focus of warfare was individual dueling between high-status leaders that was facilitated by the fact that they could be dragged around in these carts, and they could wear a superior armored kit. So they're a whole evolution above the regular fighting man who's got to trudge along. These guys actually would have plate armor and such.
So I have a very low-class version of that.
Yes.
By the way, I followed up on our last show. I took it upon myself to just challenge, a friend of mine to a little duel, and he did quite well. He had a little prior experience. But I was paranoid about my nose, and so I took it upon myself to get some proper protection for that, and I'm glad I did. But one thing I learned, and I'd love to hear any quick tips you have, was you got to keep your hands in front of your face. The whole open style that seems to be popular in boxing rings, it's not for amateurs, at least for me, because I was not really protecting myself properly. Any quick advice for beginners, real quick?
Yeah. If you're an amateur and you're fighting another amateur, you want to have your hands out in front of you. You don't want to be looking. You want to look through your hands, actually, and you hold your body obliquely so that there's this thin line that goes between your rear heel and your lead toe, and this thin line also travels between your rear palm, which could be up next to your jaw, and your lead thumb, which would be right in line with your lead eye, just to the outside of it. And this will just accidentally get in the way of most punches that are thrown at you by other amateur people. And it will at least make the guy that's at the professional level step to the side a little bit before he hits you in the nose. So.
Okay. Now, the reason I did that was for practical self-defense. It wasn't for ritual reasons.
Right.
And so I almost potentially could have used it last week, and I told all my co-hosts I got to save this for James because I want to hear what he has to say. So they don't know exactly what happened yet, but I was So I was going out for a jog, okay, and so I'm in my workout clothes, and I go into my garage and I leave my gate open because I'd gotten a package, and I was going to go back to the package briefly, but I had to check something in the garage. So the gate was ajar, all right? And I'm not that far from the street, and it's a pretty busy street, but I've never seen anything like this. So I go into the garage, finish up, come out, and I see this guy walking off with my package. And I'm like, hey. And he's like, oh, is this yours? And I'm like, yeah. And I'm like, who are you? And he's like, I'm the mailman. And I'm like, I don't think so. It's like this 4'11" Mexican guy with a sports outfit on, ironically, some Chicago Bulls bullshit. And he's like looking at the package like, oh, is this your name? And I'm like, yeah, that's mine, And so he gives it to me. I didn't know if I was going to have to fight him or not. I think he just was surprised somebody came out. But he goes off to his car. And I'm like, you're the mailman? I think you're a thief, but you got a pretty nice car there. You must be doing a lot of stealing. And he hops into his friend's car. So, they're cruising the city trying to, look for Amazon packages. I don't know what the hell these guys are doing, but what would you have done in that situation?
That's a huge pastime, man. There are countless videos on YouTube of people setting up traps for Amazon thieves. So they put a package on a doorstep, and then as soon as someone lifts the package, they have a trigger that goes off and it makes a shotgun sound. So you'll see people just start booking it as soon as they hear the fake shotgun go off.
With the heroin problem that they have in this country, there's just so many people out looking for easy money to keep their habit going. And Amazon packages, it doesn't matter where you are. I think even in high social capital, in quotation marks, parts of the country, it's still a liability if you're having packages delivered to single-family homes.
Yeah.
That's unbelievable.
In the context of our conversation, that's a feminized gathering sport that they're developing there.
Oh, yeah. Half the time it's women. A lot of the footage I've seen of people stealing Amazon packages are women. It's actually sort of shocking. I would.
It's a coward's game, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
Yes. So, what about your ritual, Adam? Did this spark a need in you for a combative ritual with your friend? Is that what happened?
It's pure instinct. When somebody does something that I think is unjust, I get really angry, and basically I don't get physical, but I will get in people's faces. That's always been how I've been. And I'm wondering if that's wise, is kind of where I'm going with this. I mean, given the size of this guy and given that I was sort of, I had kind of a workout outfit so he could see I was in shape and everything. I didn't feel like I was sort of probably going to make him feel like he could win, at least if I was going to be somewhat sort of upfront with him. That's just the gut instinct, though. It was a split-second decision. It wasn't calculated or anything. So I'm just asking practically, like, should you just let the guy walk off with it, or...
Oh, hell no. You can't let him walk off with it. He'll be back. He'll be coming in your house. As far as getting in somebody's face, that's usually only something that's good if you already know that this guy is psychologically melting and that you're the apex aggressor in the situation and he doesn't have a chance. So there's a whole middle ground of how to make this guy feel uneasy, keep him off balance, and impose your will on him without touching him and without setting yourself up to get sucker punched or grabbed or stabbed or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it both caught us totally off guard, and so it was just fight instinct instead of flight. I mean, if it was some giant dude, I don't think I would have said as much as I did, but...
Even so, he's playing a game there where he's playing on this lower level, and if he was willing to escalate, he would have already been inside of your house, or he would have been trying to take something forcibly from you because probably whatever you carried in your hand or in your pocket was worth more than that package anyhow. So as far as dealing with thieves, coming off as hyper-aggressive off the bat, as long as you don't descend into challenging insults, is usually very effective.
Yeah.
And then they can pretend, and where it will go into trouble is they want to pretend that it's a mistake or something like that. That's the face-saving thing.
Well, that's what he was trying to do, but it's so absurd. I mean, the gate is sort of basically closed. It was just hanging slightly open. He walks in and he's from the street.
If you could get your property back, okay, and avoid physical contact, by letting him save face and pretend that it was a mistake.
Okay.
That might be the difference between you having to roll with this guy and his friend or not. Yeah. And you still get your package back. So dealing with shoplifters, it's advisable when you're a security guy dealing with shoplifters, let the guy pretend that he was going to pay for it or whatever. Whatever you have to do to get him peacefully to the front door. And then when you have the property secured and you have the situation taken care of and none of your customers or staff are no longer in danger, then you can say, don't come back.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't even have to say, I know you were lying or anything like that, because he knows that he's lying. So just permitting the face-saving thing. When they go for the face-saving thing, if they're not coming towards you when they're trying to save face, then they're usually looking for an exit mode. So as long as they're not exiting with your stuff, then you've got a good resolution at hand.
Great advice. Last thing, I actually did see the police later on after I'd finished my run, and crossed my mind if I would even bother, and I didn't, because in my experience and also my intuition, they're not going to bother with this. First of all, there was no actual robbery; it was attempted robbery, and then you have to prove that. Oh, then you got to come down to the station, fill out some paperwork. It's not worth my time. They don't fucking care, and they're not going to catch this dude. So I didn't talk to them. It's more. I'm wondering if you agree or disagree with that, but it's basically one more example where the police are not there to protect you directly, if at all. They're there basically to protect large physical property and create a system whereby criminals can eventually, if they're sort of really chronic criminals, can eventually get prosecuted. But for little incidents like this where they're not there immedately, they can't help you. So you have to be able to handle this yourself. That's sort of my perspective.
Absolutely. Yeah. And now, out of your, I don't know really anything about you, Adam. I've never seen a picture of you. You got a pretty deep voice. You're out jogging. You're a millennial, so I'm guessing around 6 foot, 185, kind of fit, kind of muscular. You just want to watch. You just want to watch your chin, okay? I mean, also based on your generation, there's not too many stumps in the Anglosphere, my height in your generation. So you just want to watch where your chin is. And if you're speaking to the person and they're within range to take a step and touch you, just make sure that you have your hands extended in a speaking mode, open, not threatening. Okay, but these will immediately go to your combative hand defense guard, or maybe just go to the top of his head or to his shoulder as you avoid the screwdriver he's trying to sink into your guts. So you just want to really make sure that your chin's not on his center line. Make sure your
What if
chin's
somebody
not
hits you in the gut, though? Because like in that boxing example, if I had kept my hands up, I would have protected my face, which is kind of important, but it also opens up the sort of midsection, I would assume. And so how do you handle
like boxing? Is that what you're saying, boxing?
Or even in a fight? I mean, what is the sort of counter to that if that happens? Because I've seen a lot of movies and people will basically keel over after that.
If somebody hits you in the gut while you're boxing, well, it's going to be a long night because he knows what he's doing and he's going to try to tire you out. If somebody hits you in the gut in a non-boxing situation, you've probably been stabbed.
Ooh.
Okay, people don't punch you in the belt. There are certain, even bouncers and stuff that still hit people don't want to do it because the dude could have a heart attack. There's so many people in bad condition out there. There's not a lot of people that punch to the body as a self-defense measure unless they're like a short guy like me that has to deal with a lot of 6-foot-tall dindus with bone rack rib cages. Okay, then you just go for cracking the cage. But yeah, if somebody hits you in the gut, particularly you're talking about a Latino guy that's shorter than you, and he hits you in the gut, dude, you got stabbed.
Yeah.
That's why people go for the gut. It's with a weapon, and it's a short line from the pocket that they took it out of to your gut, as opposed to like going up to your neck or something. I've interviewed numerous men who were big, strong guys who were beating the shit out of some little twerp, and they're telling me, I was really wondering why this little faggot kept hitting me in the gut. It wasn't doing anything, and then I saw pieces of my shirt flying up in front of my face, and there's blood everywhere. Right. Yeah. So yeah, you got.
I don't have a beer belly though, so
you deny the chin, and you deny the gut. Okay, and you do it both the same way. You take a half step off, and you put your left foot right inside of his left foot.
Angle yourself a little bit so it's not
right,
it's not
and you're in a position that if he comes forward, you put your palm on his lead shoulder. If he tries to tackle you, you put your palm on his head. If that rear shoulder starts to come forward, he's either sucker punching you in the chin or he's stabbing you in the belly, and then you put your hand on that shoulder, that rear shoulder, and then you stuff his face with your rear forearm. You do like a cross face. It's some pretty simple stuff. You don't need a lot of training to do. You can just practice it with your buddy, your brother or something.
Well, I'm going to listen to that again just to make sure I got it all. Last thing, real quick. Have you ever heard of like the Houdini death story where he basically lost, his life because he didn't flex his abdominals? Maybe that's apocryphal, but in this situation, let's just say it's not a knife, or if it's just a fist. Does that actually do anything if you're actually clenched up a little bit? Does it strengthen the section?
You never want to clench while you're getting hit. Okay, when we practice with a medicine ball in a boxing gym, you're practicing inhaling or exhaling when you get hit. You don't want to clench up. You don't want to hold your breath. If you clench up, it's just stiffer meat for him to cut through if he's got a knife. And you'll actually get bruised abdominals if you clench up and he's punching you. What you want to have is a fit abdominal wall, and you want to practice while you're exhaling and moving around. Just take the inside of your wrist and your palm and smack yourself in the belly or even in the solar plexus, and just practice exhaling with it and going with it and rolling with it and continuing to move. You don't want to cause a state of muscular paralysis in your core. And I said, do no good against the knife. And the the way you get used to getting hit in the stomach is just to let somebody do it while you're doing things. Okay, I mean, you can let your little sister punch you in the belly while you got your hand on her shoulder and you're moving around her, or something like that.
What you say is completely accurate in my experience, because I did a little self-defense class, and this big dude was paired up with me for whatever reason, and that's fine because it's good training. But even through the punching bag that I was holding, the guy had knocked the wind out of me, and so I assume he hit the solar plexus. But I had to sit down for 5 minutes. Everybody's looking at me, and they thought like I was in pain, and I just couldn't breathe. Like the entire oxygen.
Yeah. Yeah, the tenser you are, the worse it is. Just think about drunks in car accidents. They aren't the ones that get killed.
Yeah.
You want to be relaxed, and that does it. This last summer, in this terrible physical condition I was in, sprained ankles, torn knee, bad hip, 30, 40 pounds overweight. I'm sparring with a muscular young stud who looks like Mr. CrossFit International. And we were boxing lightly, and he gassed out on me.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just because I was relaxed, and he was working with some new punches he hadn't worked with before, and he was tense. It literally looked like Carol O'Connor fighting a Greek god, okay? But he gasses out. And because those muscles, they all spend glycogen, and all that glycogen is contained within those muscles, and it's depleted quickly. So the more relaxed you are, the more you're engaging your red muscle fibers that run off of fatty acids. So my fat ass can toddle around for hours, and, a muscular young stud is gassed out in 30 seconds.
Well, before we get back to sports, I just want to explain to everybody who hasn't heard James's previous interviews and other shows or this show. He is the scholar on fighting from ancient times to modern times, at least in our sort of political sphere. We've all liked his work on that. And so for anybody who hasn't checked that out, definitely take a listen to the Crackpot podcast, which he does regularly with Lynn Lockhart and some of his other interviews. All right, so guys, I've been talking. Yeah. No,
so
it's true.
James,
it's true.
I have a question on what you think of CrossFit, because it's sort of this weird trend. I know a couple of people who are involved in it. Several of whom have had to have surgery because of CrossFit and then continue to go back. Do you think that it's worthwhile? Do you think it's beating people up and making them unhealthy? What do you make of it?
I don't know much about it. I coach some men who practice, who train CrossFit, and one of them is a CrossFit coach. And there is danger to anything that has ballistic elements to it.
Mm-hmm.
And ballistic elements in your training, flexibility, strength, whatever it is something that is coveted by the competitive athlete. And it's something that is therefore coveted by the non-competitive athlete who wants to emulate him, but there's an element of risk with it. Just before you get into a CrossFit program, what you want to do is make sure that you have baseline flexibility, that you don't have a problem. For instance, if you're a man, you very likely have hamstrings that are too tight for you to safely do certain ballistic motions. So first you want to have somebody check your flexibility, a yoga person or a massage therapist, my God, not a football coach. Then what you want to do is just develop baseline anaerobic fitness by doing the standard 4 sets of 15 reps with light weights, pushing one day, pulling one day, then taking a day off, it was bodybuilding when I was a kid, and it doesn't get you to the top, but it's still something you can use to get to a baseline fitness level. And then something like CrossFit, provided that you have a responsible coach, can be safely engaged in. But you don't want to go into this stuff out of shape. I've been involved in Filipino martial arts, not as a Filipino martial artist, but as an application coach for people who teach these systems, because I actually fight with sticks. And they have ballistic flexibility exercises that they do with their wrists. They hold a stick in the middle and they twirl it like a baton. I know 2 people have had their carpal tunnel torn doing that as an entry exercise. And I know from experience from somebody who has had my flexor tendons torn doing power training, where I'm trying to get to the next level. Where I'm fighting at a professional level, and I want to be able to cave an offensive match with one shot. So I'm willing to risk injury to develop this ability. And guess what? I got the injury, and I found out in recovering from the torn flexor tendon that yes, this simple ballistic exercise can actually be very damaging to the injured athlete or to the perfectly healthy non-athlete who hasn't done any preconditioning. And I like to remind you that the healthiest preconditioning you could do is walking.
Right. I mean, the two of the guys I know who have had surgery both had surgery on their wrists and their forearms due to CrossFit. One of them essentially blew out his left wrist, and it was it was unusable.
CrossFit has a tendency to become a dangerous cult.
Yeah.
I'm sort of on the edges of this world, and I know a little bit about it. And some of the gyms, or they call them boxes, I guess, are good,
they're not
right?
centrally they're not really centrally run by CrossFit. They're sort of affiliates.
Yeah, some of them are good, and they're staffed by people like Kelly Starrett, who's this genius physical therapist who's basically been teaching people how to use their bodies over the last five or 6 years. Guy out of San Francisco. But a lot of them, what will end up happening is people become competitive and they want to push a lot of weight for a lot of reps. And it's, everyone's around you rooting you on to do these lifts, and you do too much weight. I mean, I've been weightlifting since I was 13 years old, I guess. And the tendency, especially among new people, is always to push the weight at the expense of form. And when you're doing that with these compound movements they do in CrossFit, you can just annihilate your body by doing that repetitively.
Right. Yeah.
That I had powerlifting injuries and weightlifting injuries when I was a teenager, which kind of retarded my physical development one way. And it's the same atmosphere. It was young guys together being competitive. As far as looking for a safe place to do something like CrossFit, I would recommend, for instance, the guy I was talking about, for him, any minor injury is a disaster. He's always policing his people against getting injured. He trains about 6 or 7 fighters, and he does CrossFit as a supplementation to something else. If you can't afford the top dollar genius guy, that Alex was talking about, and you want to avoid the ego fest that it could devolve into, then go to somebody that's using it as a support program for something else. For instance, this guy is an MMA fighter, boxer, stick fighter, and he's doing CrossFit as a way to support himself doing for that and to develop his people. So you can find less ego investment sometimes if the person is using it as a second-tier program in their gym, because then they put it in perspective. And maybe the ego is just something that happens in the ring or the cage, not in the gym.
Hans, you gotta tell the trainer that you're just this abandoned, orphaned neighborhood kid that needs a second chance in life. That seems to be the beginning of every great boxing movie. So
yeah, man, if you look at, I'm not a great boxer. I'm much more of a brawler. As soon as something starts, I'm just throwing my body weight at the guy, trying to get him on the ground, and then I'm just using my elbows at that point.
Well, when it comes to training, if you want to look at how people at the top generally do it in any sport, it doesn't look competitive when they're doing it.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the first things you do to avoid that injury is to take the competitive aspect out of your training, so you can pursue it more soberly.
Mm-hmm. Well, I have a theory on the history of U.S. sports, kind of in line with what you guys were talking about at the beginning of the episode. Generally, my suspicion is that U.S. sports started as sort of a Tocquevillian American small organizations pastime. You had a lot of local groups just looking for ways to pass the time, and it became very popular in urban areas because people just were slowly working out less and less because their jobs are becoming less and less physically intensive. And then you had a lot of the early forms of the general American pastimes, so that essentially be baseball, football, hockey, horse racing, and ice skating. Those all grew into these huge industries. I think that North American sports industry is going to be worth between 70 and 80 billion by 2020, from what I had read. I
would assume it'd be even more, to be honest.
Think of the investments that they make in these stadiums.
Yeah, so that's
without doxing. Like every American city has these enormous
it's insane
stadiums for college too, not just for the NFL and the NBA.
And I think that it's gotten out of hand. So my general theory, before I get into some numbers, is that it started as just a way of passing the time, and what Americans have always been known for is their love of small local organizations. That's why Little League is hugely popular across the United States, because it's a way of, it functions similar to the church for a local community. Your Little League or your local football league, soccer.
Wait, what's a local community?
Yeah, I was a little surprised when I heard that. Like, what do you mean by that, Hans?
What is a community? I got a Walmart.
Yeah, because it seems like most Americans are basically trained by California culture, which essentially was what Hollywood is.
Right, but
okay, so that's the last 20, 30.
James, say something.
With what Hans is saying, though, yeah, I mean, you guys are saying, what is a community? We don't have many or any of them left, but people, particularly parents and grandparents, my age and older, will now look at sport as a substitute for community. You have this temporary little community. That's why my mother pushed me into sports, team sports that I was not interested in when I was a small child, because she wanted to socialize me. And, the alternative was abandoning me to the suburban sprawl when she went to her part-time job after I got out of school.
It's funny, we're separated by, I don't know, a generation at least, and my mom did the same thing, and I had no interest, none. I hated it, but I understand why she did it too, and I don't blame her for that. But it's funny hearing that from you.
So I think that and when I see it promoted, pony baseball, when I see Little League football promoted, particularly in the area I'm at, they promote football. It's billed by the people promoting it as a way to keep your kids out of trouble, and there's a picnic function. I did a lot of stick fighting sparring on a basketball court as Little League football practiced for a couple of years, and we actually sparred right next to the grill. You'd have these older black dudes out there grilling hot dogs and hamburgers for everybody. It was like a picnic. It really was an attempt for these people to have a temporary sense of community. And you actually had all of these women with no husbands and no boyfriends bringing these half-orphan boys to these temporary father figures.
Wow.
So I think, it's still legitimate to use community in the context.
Yeah. I mean,
no, I think that's a positive aspect to it. Don't get me wrong. I'm surprised to think of sports that way, given how big national football and baseball are. It's kind of a very non-local phenomenon, it seems, for the amount of time most people spend.
That's a recent development. Like, so the numbers I have are essentially that starting in the 50s, you had the growth of the mega stadiums, and you had the growth of a lot of the subsidies. That we'll get into that. The subsidies, that's how most of these are paid for in the 50s, and then from 91 to 2004. So the end of the Soviet Union to the height of the Iraq War, the second one, there were 78 stadiums, 5.6 a year, built or underwent like a massive renovation. That was about $26 billion. Over 60% of that was public money in one way or another. But there was a study released in around 2007 by a Harvard guy who determined that about 80% on average of mega stadiums and mega complexes are essentially paid for by the public, both in direct and hidden costs. There's been several studies from Brookings Institute and then a big one from Mercatus Center, which I'll link, that essentially proves that these things are an economic dead zone. They either don't contribute anything at all, or they actually are a detriment to the local economy.
I saw something last week. I think it was on New Year's Day. It was a classic hockey game between two New York hockey teams.
Right.
It was billed as being played in Mets Stadium, but it wasn't Mets Stadium. The name of the stadium was named after a bank. I forget what bank it was here. In Baltimore, we don't have Ravens Stadium. We have M&T Bank Stadium.
Yeah, down in San Diego, you have Qualcomm Stadium,
right?
Semiconductor Stadium.
This is what killed sports for me. I mean, I was this
is kind of what I was getting at. Like you had the development of local sports across the United States, and then it kind of got a little national, but it wasn't taken super seriously in the corporate level, and it was just sort of I think maybe from the 50s to the 80s, let's say, just a nice national pastime. You know, everyone kind of will tune in to watch their team on the TV, and then, okay, we'll go do something else. You didn't have like a 4-hour sit-in where you watch your Sports Center highlights from every team, from every sport playing, and you think you got to keep up with all of it.
We could look at the anachronistic semantics as a clue here. I mean, we've used the term sports a lot here. We also apply the term games. All of our historians, almost all of our historians, apply the term games to the sacred agons of the Greeks and the munera of the Latins, which means rights due the dead. The term sport was inherited from the sporting set, or a sport, was a risk taker. He was outside of the middle class, managerial class wheelhouse. He was the American inheritor of the fancy. The fancy in 1700s England was an alliance of poor working men and athletes and wealthy old money patrons who were rebelling against middle class values. And at the whole time during the course of this boxing, this 150 years of boxing, it was a crime. It was outlawed. The middle class managers of the society sicked the police on anybody that promoted a boxing match or a prize fight. And in America, this became the sporting set. As a rejection of the managerial middle class system. And it included, first of all, it included ethnic division and rivalry. On the boxing set, you would have a lot of interracial cross-pollination, with the boxing, okay? But ethnically, with the Irish and the Jewish and the Italian and the nativist English, you would have gang-supported boxers. The middle class, the managerial class, hated the ethnic element. They hated the gang element. They hated the interracial element, where you have Jack Johnson and a bunch of his white friends would get together and they would hold spoofs of American politics at the boxing gym. They'd elect the president for the day and he would spank the other guys and everything. So there's this whole element of spitting at the civic order, this nanny state that was blooming back then, and trying to shackle you to this factory job. So then when you see the little beer leagues that have been gotten together on these people's own initiative, supported by a local brewery, which would be a micro pub by today's standards, when you see athletic organizations that are governmental bodies taking these over and formulating rules and everything, you're actually seeing the managerial hijacking of this athletic counterculture. which
I think that's summed up
included
really well.
dog fighting, cockfighting, playing pool, throwing darts, horseshoes.
Yeah.
It was a whole package. It was like, if you're not a sport unless you're a guy that's willing to break the law in some small way, even if you're a stand-up citizen. You got to be willing to do something to find the face of authority to even be a sport.
I could see the Irish, back in like the 1870s, 1920s, that interval, when they had a lot of ethnic solidarity. I could see the Irish being the sort who would sort of use like the business of underground boxing or semi-gray market boxing as like an ethnic racket, essentially.
Oh, the big rivalries in boxing in the early and mid 1800s was the nativist English and the Irish Americans, and they would have their own guy. And half of these fights, they never came to a satisfactory conclusion because everybody piled into the ring as soon as something went wrong. So some of them would devolve into gang fights. So there were reasons why civic authorities would frown on this. But the idea that you have these sports, and even the term sport, and sportsmanship was supposed to be an honorable regard. Well, we're not following rules here, empowered, that are set down from above. We're observing each other's honor. We're being sports. When you see that, and it's taken and it's put into some kind of, this almost industrial mold like football, where you're an interchangeable part. You can't even play offense and defense. In baseball parlance, every football player is a retard. Yeah, because he can only play offense or defense for the most part and have any good effect.
I never thought of that way.
The industrial nature of football.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's the big money sport today, it's almost as if it was engineered as this ride-along metaphor for what was being done to the people in the industrial setting.
I want to get to football, but I have a couple quick questions about boxing since we were talking about that briefly. And as well as the sort of nativist versus ethnic rivalries. I'm sure you've seen, although I shouldn't assume since you hadn't seen Fight Club, which I hope you've seen at this point. We'd all want to know what you think if you have. But have you seen Gangs of New York? I thought that was sort of a
I saw that twice.
Portrayal.
I liked it very much. I read a history book that supported it also.
Do you think it's accurate?
From the book I read on the 5 points, it seemed like the movie, as far as Hollywood movies go,
right, was
closer to accurate than you're usually going to find with historical treatments.
Right. And that very it was I don't think it was boxing, but it was very visceral, and that they had a lot of knives.
And there was a little bit of boxing in there.
There was a boxing match.
Yeah. There was a famous boxer of that era in New York, and his nickname was Old Smoke, and he was most famous not for winning a boxing match. In fact, I don't think he was ever recognized as a champion. He beat up two longshoremen in a belaying pin fight on the docks on the waterfront. So you'd have a boxer was a guy that he might win some bet money for you as a fight, but primarily this is a guy that a gang leader or a businessman wanted to be walking by his side down the alley or on the dock or down the street.
So it's almost like a display of prowess to the public, whereas it's a spectacle now. Would you agree with that contrast?
Yes, it is. And by the character I'm talking about, the bare-knuckle boxer who becomes like the sidekick of the gang leader in the 1800s in the ethnic setting, the counterpart for that in ancient Greece was in the Hellenistic age, right after Alexander, about the time of Alexander's conquest, and thereafter until the Roman conquest, in which tyrants would typically have a parasite that was their sidekick and would hang out with them and would be a bodyguard and a bully, and he was usually a champion pancratiast or champion boxer or champion wrestler.
Right.
So you could see these cycles going farther back in history. In fact, the guy that strangled Commodus in his bathtub was a wrestler. Again, he's like a strong man, happens to be around, good for something in a pinch, like wringing the emperor's neck.
Wow. Last question about boxing. Even I got sucked into it, but it was just, for me, it was kind of the kind of national ethnic sort of component that made it interesting. With Mayweather, I think he's retired now. I actually first got sucked into it when he was fighting Pacquiao, and I wrote about this in an article. But what actually kind of upset me was when they introduced them in the ring, they didn't even start with either the Philippine or the American national anthem. They started with the Mexican national anthem. If you talk about how crass this is becoming, it was sponsored by Tecate beer. All right.
That's right.
So I think that was the motivation there, as well as, who knows, appealing to some fans. But it was just bizarre. And of course, Mayweather has made God knows how much money in total, but he's probably been the most heavily compensated boxer. And then the McGregor fight was also this sort of Irish, ethnic versus this African guy who's going to win. Everybody was getting into it, and that was not even hidden. I think everybody was just sort of interested in that aspect. And so I think it's still there, but it seemed to have also been heavily commercialized as well. Somewhat shamelessly, perhaps, but people wanted it. Sorry, go ahead.
I covered the fight for my site. I pitched in with a friend of mine who's a karate instructor and a guy named Big Ron who used to box, and I did his biography. He's a notable carpenter and street fighter in Baltimore. So we actually watched it together. Big Ron billed it as the Money McNugget fight. So, I mean, we didn't have high expectations biomechanically.
That's funny.
What you saw in the fight, actually, they cut off the video and audio from Mayweather's corner because his uncle was laughing out loud after the first round. And they actually show it after the fight. And his uncle say, look, whenever you want to cash the check, just go ahead. It's that bad. I had 21 boxing matches. I only won 7 of them. I think when I was 41, I could have eked out a decision against McGregor in a boxing match. Now, I'd last 5 seconds in an MMA fight with him, okay? So the same with Mayweather, okay? But as far as boxing goes, he was ill-prepared. His corner did a horrible job. He only had 2 technically correct punches. His corner didn't know how to get him to set up the one. And when he threw the other one by accident, they didn't say, hey, repeat that, because they didn't even know what it was. These guys didn't even know what an up jab was. But what you saw in that fight was Mayweather trying not to get lynched in the media. And what he did in the first 5 rounds, for instance, if we had Hans came to the Lock Raven Boxing Club, okay, and Hans described himself, he wants to get in there and brawl, and so we know we got to ease our way through that. What I would do is I would put Hans in there with the best pro fighter in the gym. Okay, Tony Saigon, or I'd put him in there with Alex, or I'd put him in there with Oliver. And these guys would not hit Hans. And Hans could do all the brawling he wanted, but eventually, while they're talking to him, while they're not hitting him back, and they're maybe tapping him on the shoulder and telling him to move around a little bit, eventually he'll start to get the hang of getting relaxed. And then he'll start to use his tools more, and he'll get better. And Hans will improve 1,000% in that one session. Okay, that's what Mayweather did. What Mayweather did with McGregor was the same thing that a pro boxer would do with somebody that came into the boxing gym for their very first time, and you just want to get them in there and throw punches at somebody. And get the idea that it's about being relaxed, because they'll pick up on it after they've been winging punches at this guy for 5 rounds and they're not hitting them. They'll pick up on the fact, like, okay, I got to back it up a little bit, relax, and this guy's going to show me some things. And then the hilarious thing is the guy that ended up, as far as behaviorally speaking, the guy that ended up being the African American in the fight was McGregor. Who didn't act like a gentleman and trash talked after this referee basically saved him from permanent injury. I mean, it was really, my friend that's a karate instructor, as soon as he saw McGregor, he said, oh my God, he's going to get killed. This is going to be horrible. Somebody stop it. And I'm like, no, Mayweather's not going to let that happen. Mayweather's job is to make sure nobody gets killed and nobody looks too stupid. And most of the people that paid for this aren't going to know the difference. As long as they see gloves flying and the guys are close to each other, they'll feel like it was a fight. And they'll feel like their guy was in it. And the people that really know boxing are going to actually come away with a little bit of respect for Mayweather for being somebody who actually might be able to coach somebody. Because basically what he did was coach sparring for like 5 rounds with McGregor. I mean, so when you go back and look at it, I think I could have actually trained McGregor to be a threat to Mayweather if somebody would have given me 6 months with him, which meant he would have got knocked out in the second round. So it wouldn't have done him any favors.
Yeah, because, I mean, that's the whole, like,
if you're not that quality a guy, I mean, people don't understand the gaps in performance. I mean, my brother was on the Army boxing team in Italy, and he wasn't the best guy. And the last time I boxed him, I never hit him. He eventually sprained his wrist hitting me and had to quit. And he's coughing up cigarette tar because he had started smoking. And the dude hit me 400 times. I never hit him back. And you go on to the amateur level that he didn't move up to, then the elite amateur level, and you keep going up. And there's like 6 levels of performance where the best guy at this level can't even lay a glove on that guy. And so these guys know that. So, McGregor, his job was to put on a show and, cash the check and everything. And Mayweather's job was to try to make it look like it was a fight.
Well, yeah, they both of them did not, looking back at least, it doesn't seem like they actually were trying to box. It was basically just to promote and to
Mayweather had to let this guy hit him.
Yeah.
He had the second round, he puts his gloves up and he just walks right up to the guy. And he's probably telling him, hit me. Because he figured out almost immediately that if he just did what he would naturally do, just trying to maintain his space and get his timing down and set the guy up for the knockout, that the guy would never get near him. The guy, seriously, I trained 5 guys that have better footwork than McGregor. He's a successful MMA competitor, but he's a very crude version of it. I mean, in MMA, there's so many ways of winning and losing. You can do certain things that are extremely crude. And if you're dynamic enough, you're going to pay less often than you cash in. And he's had that happen for him.
Okay,
but
this is
with boxing, you're talking about a duel. If you're talking about a duel, okay? If this would have been like, if those guys had knives and they were in an alley and it was for keeps, McGregor's got a slit throat inside of 3 seconds. And
that's what I was going to ask, because it seems like you have much more freedom in MMA, and how comparable is that to actual fighting versus boxing?
Okay, if you look at as a self-defense metric, I like boxing because it at least helps you prepare for the knife fight. Okay, I have a friend of mine who I coached for, who has a very good friend who is a top-level Brazilian jiu-jitsu instructor and champion. Got in a fight in a bar with some guy. Lost half his spleen, lost part of his liver, got a lung punctured, got a kidney nicked, almost died. Other dude had a knife. This guy's slapping the Holy Grail triangle on. Boom, 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 boom. You stab 7 times in 2 seconds. Fortunately, the guy that stabbed him didn't even know how to use a knife, because if he'd have just stabbed him once and then ripped, he'd be dead. Boxing, there's at least the duelist sense that you have to control time and measure. MMA is such a dynamic spectacle that if you don't have the ability to control the time and measure, you could actually just charge at the guy screaming and you might get in. Okay? So when you come from this kind of sport and then you get involved in a situation where the other guy is not engaged in sport, where he has a razor blade or he has a screwdriver or he's reaching for a brick behind him while you're doing a single leg, okay, well then MMA gets you killed. because it's a pure sport. It's not a self-defense form. At least boxing goes back to a self-defense form. Boxing, in its modern form, was a method developed by fencing masters so that their students could successfully fend off a wrestler. Because the poor kids that were being sent into the city without jobs due to the Enclosure Acts in England, these guys all had wrestling traditions, basically like judo we would think of it as judo or Greco-Roman wrestling. And they would get into street fights with the guys in the city. Well, the guys in the city that are going to stand up and fight with these guys were actually the penniless nobility, the guys that would carry around sword canes or swords. And of course, they can't run this guy through. That's not kosher. So their fencing masters actually teach them how to beat up these strong country boys using fencing techniques with their fists. So most of your bare knuckle boxing in England was in fact a match that took place on turf with golfing cleats on. They're modified golfing cleats, in which you have a wrestler who's trying to throw this guy to the ground, and the other guy is a stand-up boxer who's boxing this guy. So it's actually like a boxing versus grappling situation. In that situation, either guy, and this might change. You might be the wrestler in this match, and the other match you're the boxer. In that situation, either perspective is a legitimate street self-defense perspective that grants you enough sensitivity and time and measure, tactile sensitivity on one hand, and visual time and measure and rhythm on the other hand, to be able to keep from getting done in by some guy with a knife, because that's the guy that's the most dangerous guy in every setting.
So essentially, boxing is an art form or a method or a discipline that is designed to prepare you for an unconstrained or a less constrained combat environment. And MMA, oddly enough, is actually, by being I guess more free form in its application, it actually isn't as applicable in a street fighting and unconstrained combat scenario.
No, it's not. It has more tools. MMA has more tools that are functional on the street than boxing does. But MMA does not have a functional street framework.
Because you're vulnerable to the knives and the other things.
One of 3 men in Baltimore carry a knife. Mm-hmm. As soon as he knows he's getting his face fed to him and he doesn't have a chance, that knife is coming out and it's going in your belly. And MMA's got nothing that prepares you for that. There was an MMA fighter from the early days, a pioneer named Mario Sperry, who lost a notable match to a guy named Igor, who was a Russian sambo guy or judo guy. He actually taught Brazilian jiu-jitsu as a stand-up art where you do it against a car, a truck, a fence, a wall. So you don't get your head stomped in and you don't get your guts shanked out. So there's that background in there, but as MMA is billed now, it's really, it's this hyper-masculine rejection of modernity that's actually been harnessed by the whole modern managerial machine as this money-making machine. Okay, and the people in the martial arts fraternity who aren't providing daycare for children instead of teaching karate, they've jumped onto this BJJ MMA bandwagon, and they're trying to promote this as self-defense. And it's not. It's a very specific sport. Now, the counterpart to this sport was Pancratian, all-power fighting in the ancient world. And that was promoted as a psychological school for diplomats and brigade commanders. It was a thinking man's art. Some boxers, you didn't have boxers, wrestlers, and MMA guys in the ancient world. Okay, everybody wrestled, everybody boxed. Some certain people did Pancratian, and they were special people. And you will see these men overrepresented as ambassadors and as military commanders at the battalion and regimental level. Okay, so
could you describe the sport? What is Pancratian?
Pancratian is MMA. It was fought on the dug up. It was called the skama, which means the dug up. And there's no fence, there's no rope, there's no ring. If you get pushed out of the ring, you lose, you quit. So you think of that. You think of MMA, where you have to say, you can't permit this guy to sumo you out of the ring or else you get humiliated. So these guys are committed to going at it. They trained in mud. They were allowed to do anything but bite and gouge. They were even allowed to break fingers. You could do small joint manipulation. A guy from a place called Sikion was called the high hander, because he would use the high hand guard to break your fingers, and then he would do whatever he needed to do to you. The ancient boxing that the Greeks practiced, you were not allowed to bite or gouge. You were also not allowed to grab, and you were not allowed to kick. If you grabbed, kicked, bit, or gouged, the judge beat you with an olive rod until you quit doing what you were doing. There's illustrations of this. If your opponent went down, you could continue beating him until he quit. It was a pure submission art. There was one record of a match in which both of the men agreed to take a break halfway through. Okay. Other than that, there's not known to be any round structure, and it was single elimination, 3 to 7 rounds. So you win the Olympic Pancratian. That means that you dismantled like 3 of the baddest guys in your culture on the same day in August.
This must have given the name to that Japanese, I don't know if they still do it, but there's a Japanese ring base. Pancrase, yeah. Pancrase.
Bas Rutten was a 3-time king of Pancrase.
Exactly. Yes. That's how I know about it, from Bas Rutten and Joe Rogan.
The British bare knuckle boxing. There was a book that I read at the Peabody called Pancratian. It was a whole history of the bare knuckle boxers. They did not compare their boxing art to ancient boxing, except in metaphor. They compared it behaviorally to ancient Pancratian, because what bare knuckle boxing was, and this would have been a way for Mayweather and McGregor to have a fair fight. Bare knuckle boxing was boxing and judo with no ground game. Okay, so you fight until somebody goes down. Now, he might go down because you punched him. He might go down because you did a cross buttock throw. He might go down because you did a heel trip on him. He might go down because you're a gorilla and you picked him up and you smashed him on his back. Okay, and then he's got 30 seconds to get back to the center line and scratch, and then you start fighting again. On average, these rounds only went about 1.5 minutes, but sometimes you would have a round that could go 20 minutes. It was common for a fight to go 20 or 30 rounds. Most men, and he was the toughest men of their era, only survived 3 of these bouts before they had to retire. Tom Cribb, who was the heavyweight champion, which means the champion because they didn't have any weight classes, he was selected by his patron as a prospective prize fighter because his patron owned a shipping company. And Tom Cribb was underneath a pallet of freight that was being hauled off of a ship onto a dock when the cables gave way, and the whole pallet crashed down on top of Tom Cribb and smashed him. They all thought he was dead. All these men heaved this pallet off of him, and he gets up and he continues working his shift. So the guy that saw that, the rich man that saw that, he said, "You're not going to work anymore. You're going to be a fighter." They're choosing the toughest specimens. There was a free black man named Richmond, who was a bartender in a tavern in New York City when Howe was there during the Revolutionary War. Some of the British soldiers picked a fight with this man who I believe was a mulatto. He wasn't a full Negro. He knocked out all 3 of these guys, and General Howe adopted him and brought him back to England. And the man served as, he beat everybody but Tom Cribb. He couldn't because Tom Cribb was too big. And he served as a boxing trainer for decades thereafter. So you actually have the top guys in the society who aren't part of the managerial class, who are into the military aspect, and sometimes you'll have guys that own shipping businesses or whatever. That's something that wasn't too humiliating, that owns some ships that might at least have some cannons on them. These guys would all be scouting for their man, You know, as they say, that's my man, and he's my fighter. And then they patronize him, and they bet on him, and so on. And you have this whole masculine cult. There's statues. I think of lions. I think in Britain you have maned lions dedicated to Tom Cribb. He was so loved by the people in Great Britain. You know, so you have that would have been a fair Mayweather-McGregor fight. If McGregor was allowed to throw Mayweather on his ass or to trip him and throw him down, that would have made it a fair fight, and you could have actually enjoyed what would have probably been a pretty dangerous contest in which both men would have been injured.
So James, I don't want to throw out a non sequitur, without acknowledging that it's a non sequitur, but so I remember in the period of roughly 2012 to 2015, 2016,
yes,
there was this women's MMA craze in America, and everyone, at least in like the sphere who was talking about MMA, was talking about Ronda Rousey.
Right.
Were you at all aware of that? I think she got beat pretty badly, and that phenomenon's dead because the girls who replaced her are a little bit too roided up for the public.
Joe Rogan was like in love with her.
Yeah.
He's in love with a lot of people, but anyhow, the female MMA thing, it's not crazy I got into. I only watched it as long as Gina Carano was fighting. I could stomach watching this beautiful, well-built woman who's highly intelligent beat up Bull Dykes. I could handle that, okay? It wasn't my thing, but I can handle it. But as soon as they let that mutant steroid freak, Chris Cyborg, do the prison rape thing on Gina Carano, I was like, I'm not watching one of these things again. Now, it was
a freak show.
It's still a thing because some of the guys that I coach still follow it. You know, some of the guys I coach are big fans of the chick who's fighting Cyborg, some Viking girl, but I don't like it. I wouldn't mind having a couple of these chicks as bodyguards, but
would you care to diagnose society? Like, the thing that fascinated me about women's MMA was just how unnatural it was that we were evaluating women on these criteria.
Yeah, and
putting them in a ring and fighting like this.
I can give a personal story to that. I was at a sports bar, and they had one of these vintage arcade things, but then they had this boxing punching bag meter. So if you hit it, you're a strong man, or if you're Olympian, there's all these scales that jumps up like the love meter. And I remember my friend and I were trying it, and I did okay. And then this chick, she rolls in there, and she's got her orbiter crew around her, the beta males, that's what we call them today, the orbiters. And they take off her jacket like she's entering the ring, and she's got this tube top on, and she smacks the hell out of the thing, and she gets almost to the top above me. And I'm looking at my friend, and I'm like, I don't want to fuck that. That is not attractive. That is bizarre. I don't get it. But apparently these guys do, so...
That's a great story. Well, that's where we've gotten. Now, the thing that really lost me with the Gina Carano, Chris Cyborg thing is at that point, you've got to the point where you've taken the sport to this level where in order for the women to excel at the top level, because, the Spartans, they had female athletes. I didn't have no problem with female athletes. But then you take this thing to the point where in order for them to excel at the top level, they're no longer female. I bet these women are no longer menstruating. They've all had that
happens to gymnasts. I mean,
yeah,
I wouldn't be surprised.
The girl who beat Rousey the first time had telltale signs of clitoral enlargement from anabolics.
And this is obscene, and socially the most indicting aspect of it is what you mentioned about these orbiters, which I think is a great term. I'll have to add it to the lexicon. Young guys that I worked with were so passionately excited about these female fights. And I'm like, look, I can see watching the one girl because she's got a nice ass, and the other one because she's got good technique, but I can't see getting vested in this. It's kind of obscene to get vested in it, but I also know these men personally, and I know that they didn't have fathers, and that their mothers took on a masculine role, and their favorite movies are all female superhero movies.
That's
and these
bizarre.
are millennial dudes.
I always assumed the Wonder Woman stuff was
twisted.
like chicks buying those tickets, but oh man.
Yeah. It's really, and I find it among. There's a small circle of young science fiction and comic book writers that really they almost throw up anytime I come around here. But so they don't talk to me anymore. But they were all obsessed with female protagonists. And none of them ever wrought a realistic female character, but they were obsessed with female protagonists. And I found out that it was because none of them ever had any masculine father or big brother image in their life or anything. And they're they're like these weird orbiting drones, like you said. But if you want to look at the lie about the female ability, combat ability, it's good to look at MMA. You look at the top MMA fighter. They can beat all the other MMA fighters, okay? That's going to be the heavyweight, not the super heavyweight, in the male division. And it's going to be a 155-pounder in the female division. So you'll see this. I was working in a supermarket. It was about 6 weeks ago, and two couples were shopping in the dairy bakery aisle at the same time. One of them was this fit-looking muscle couple, okay, that were buying yogurt. And this dude is 6'5", 240 pounds, looks like he's carved out of iron. And he's got an equally fit female partner who is tall for a woman. She's like 5'7", and she goes about 130. But when you look at the two degenerates that are shopping the donut case, there's this big beard guy that looks like a gigantic Pillsbury Doughboy with hair pasted on him. And his female, he's about 6'4", 450. And these people are in their mid to late 20s. She's about 5'8", 380. And there's not a whole lot of difference in their physique. They're like these giant, saggy, bruised pears that have been bleached. But when
are they
look
black?
No, these were both Caucasian pairs.
The only reason I asked that is because I've heard African women have a lot of testosterone.
Yes. Well, this man was built like a white woman. Okay, I mean, this gigantic white woman and this gigantic white man, morbidly obese.
Big hips?
Yes, they both had big hips, and maybe his shoulders were as wide as mine, but he was, this guy's 450, and he's built like this big saggy pear, and she was built the same way. But when you looked at the fit, muscular couple that were mostly lean body mass and they were eating healthy, there's this huge difference in their size, and there's also a very big difference in their shape. It looked like the male shape of the obese couple was mimicking the female shape. And
he's got all that fat. The fat is associated with estrogen, correct?
There you go. And the female shape, this girl wasn't roided or anything. She was just a nicely built chick with B cups and a nice curvy frame and probably a 24-inch waist, I guess. Maybe 130 pounds, 5'7". She's a nice looking girl. We would probably all find her physically attractive. And her counterpart is a guy that looks like he could be an ancient statue or the heavyweight MMA guy. So there's it's really kind of bizarre how you look like, you have these certain small specialized domestic humans that are like these specialized dogs, like the real fit couple. And then you got the other humans are like these gigantic slovenly mutts that are just like living on this feedlot. It's really strange.
Sadly, that's like becoming more of the norm than the other, I would say.
Oh, well, that's what I see with the young men that I work with. And these are Caucasian and African American, very few people of other races, but predominantly Caucasian in this location. And I've had these discussions with some of the men my age that I worked with about the shapes of these guys. The big guys, like the heavy guys, their hips are wider than their shoulders. They're real big 300-pounders. And even if they're not really obese, And the thin guys are built like rails. They're built like, I always really felt sorry for the skinny, nerdish black guy who was built like a 4x4, and he had to spend his life growing up with these like gigantic, violent toddlers. Okay. What a nightmare his life must have been.
Gentle Giants. Michael Brown.
Right. Yeah. But you'll see all these white guys that are built like skinny black nerds used to be built in the 70s. And of course, that was an oddity. That was like one dude out of like 50 black dudes, right? And then the other ones are all built like the one morbidly obese guy I had in my 7th grade class. I mean, there was only one fat kid in my whole 7th grade class. I specifically remember that because he was a point of discussion in health class because he brought it up. He wanted to know if he had anything to worry about health-wise because of his weight. He was literally the only fat kid in the whole school. And now he's like 1 in 3. And then most of the other ones are just these, bug men, beanpole guys. So there's something going on.
New male is the
chemically.
One of the terms. Yeah.
Which, it's
people don't move. I mean, I see these this certain class of like middle-aged female in my office environment where they've got like 20, 25 years of sitting down and and driving to work, and they become like roughly I don't know, half as wide as they are tall.
Well, I think your sort of rear end actually starts to take the shape of a chair. I'm not kidding.
No, your tissues absolutely remodel given whatever novel stimulus you subject them to. Like your fingers will curve as you use a computer keyboard for decades and so on.
Yeah.
So we have weirdly engineered human subtypes propping up in the population and becoming sometimes visually dominant. So it's scary.
So let's get back to the
I have
events.
a sports question, some sports stuff for James.
Yes.
One of the things we were talking about earlier, we were kind of comparing hockey and intercity boxing, which is something I'd always noticed, is that a good example of this sort of regionalism in U.S. sports is there's a film made about this, Miracle with Kurt Russell. It's about the 1972 Winter Olympics.
Yeah, I saw those guys play.
Yeah, in Oslo, and it's essentially the story of how the U.S. beat the Soviet hockey team, which was at that time the best hockey team in the planet.
And they were pros.
Yeah, and the story is that Kurt Russell's character, the coach, him and his guys go around recruiting the best of the best for U.S. hockey, and the majority of them come from states that essentially hug the Canadian border or Massachusetts. That the entirety of the ethnography of his team were Anglos, Nords from Minnesota and Wisconsin, and a bunch of Irish kids from rural Massachusetts or suburban Massachusetts, kind of kids that would grow up playing very amateur hockey when they were 10 years old on the local frozen pond or something. Kids who from day one had a pair of ice skates on their feet. But you don't really see that in certainly in California, and there were no recruits coming from the West Coast or the South. But whenever we have sporting events involving football or even occasionally, I guess, professional car racing, it's overwhelmingly people from either the Midwest or the South who make up the best of America's football stock. And you have the same thing with baseball coming from the Mountain West and the West Coast and some of the South as the best baseball players typically hailing from those regions. I don't know if that's something you've also noticed, is that each region of the U.S. specializes typically in one thing or another, and then you have certain states which are very specialized, like Kentucky is known for horse racing, mostly because there's just a long tradition of raising horses in Kentucky and Tennessee.
You're shopping culturally at one level. For instance, in MMA, you're shopping for a guy that was a nationally ranked collegiate wrestler.
Right.
Best material out there, best work ethic out there. Guy can make weight like nobody. Okay. Boxing, you're not shopping. Boxing is an exception. You're not shopping culturally. You're shopping economically. You're looking for the most desperate people who no longer come from American inner cities. You still have boxing gyms in American inner cities, but most of the standout boxers don't come from there. They go there because that's where the coaches are. Because with boxing, you have one race of guys or one ethnic group of guys will end up translating the knowledge as coaches to the next crop of guys who are desperate enough to do this. So right now you've got your guys from Asia, Latin America, and Eastern Europe. They're all looking for old school black trainers in American cities. Or they're looking for Freddie Roach. Okay. And you had in the.
And who did the black trainers inherit their tradition, the boxing tradition?
They inherited it from Jewish and Italian and Irish trainers.
Okay.
Okay.
Yeah.
Joe Choinsky, you had was a Jewish guy who fought Jack Johnson and then coached him while they were locked up in prison for the fight they were in. So you have, with boxing, it's basically you have this art keeps getting handed back and forth across these different ethnic lines. And there's been a lot of, before I go too far on it, Hans, with the raw material for the football, if you look at real college scouting reports, not at who gets into the NFL, you'll find that it's even more predominantly people from rural areas and not urban areas that are standouts in football. I've had a couple of high-level football coaches contact me and tell me that they've had some of the fastest and strongest and most dynamic white players passed over for more marketable black players, which frustrates them because the black dudes are more prone to injury because they have longer tendons and shorter muscles, which down the road it's a problem. But in the meanwhile, the middle-aged housewife wants to see her pet flying through the air. Okay. Right. Yeah. Okay. But with the boxing body types, when it depends, for instance, for the last 15 years, the heavyweight division has been dominated by white men. For 15 years. The whole time I was growing up, I had people tell me, oh, you can't box. Only black people can box. No white man can ever beat a black person. Most baby boomers still believe that black people still have this natural boxing gene and they can beat anybody, that nobody can compete with black people in boxing. But it's the way the different types of human frames size up. Okay, you'll look now, you'll have certain weight classes are dominated by certain ethnic groups. And the weight class that favors the West African black body type, okay, there are two weight classes that favor that predominantly. One is the 5'8" to 6 foot tall, 145 to 165 pound range. That range right there. That's where Mayweather has made his money. Okay. And the other range is the small heavyweight, which 100 years ago was the big heavyweight. Okay. So once you got to the point where humans are just overfed and nobody's lacking nutrition, then you actually see how the different human races supersize. And what you find out is black dudes do not supersize well. It's hard to get an effective black striking athlete over 230 pounds. Okay, the occasional George Foreman will come along, but for the most part, the guys that supersize really well are Eastern Europeans. For instance, nobody wants to see a Mexican heavyweight contender. He's either going to be fat or he's going to suffer from gigantism. So
Eastern Europeans are pretty predominant in basketball too. Like the NBA is notorious for being a mostly
Yugoslavs, those tall Slavs.
Yeah. I mean, there was an article the other day I saw about the Herzegovinian gene. There's a particular gene in Herzegovinian and nearby populations that gives men abnormal height for that region.
Yeah, that might be the region.
Yugoslavs are tall.
Yeah,
kickboxing.
The tallest people in the world are in some part of former Yugoslavia. It may be what you just said, Hans.
And kickboxing is owned by European men. For one thing, I mean, height means a lot in kickboxing, but the
Jean-Claude
thickness.
Van Damme.
Well,
I'm actually becoming a minor fan of his. I just saw a movie that I liked.
Yeah, there's a new one.
In kickboxing, the potential thickness of the bony cortex, of the shin bone, is super important. Okay, I've seen one Asian man and two black men snap their shin bones in half in kickboxing matches and MMA matches. Polish guys are pretty much immune to this. Okay, so
yeah, that's another one. Like Polish, and you were mentioning Irish, Italian, and Jewish boxers, but Polish boxers were huge. Like there were a lot of Croatian and Polish boxers in the inner cities, and that like the golden era of immigrant. Once the urban English working class had sort of died out or moved out, it was it was 5 or 6 major immigrant groups that dominated inner city boxing. And there was a lot of levels. There was the more professional levels, and then there was the dirt cheap kind of underground boxing rings that you have guys pay for cash and a beer to get in. A good movie on that is that a lot of people haven't seen is the Ron Howard movie with Russell Crowe.
Cinderella Man.
Yeah, Cinderella Man.
That was a good movie, and it was a good boxing movie.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great movie. It's a great insight into how weird boxing was in that kind of golden age of immigrant, I guess, inner city boxing from the late, let's say the 1870s until the end of World War II, where you had, all the way through the Depression, you just had all of these groups in New England and mid-Atlantic cities at various levels of boxing. Some of them were nationally broadcast across radio, and some of them were in a basement of a building somewhere. And the film takes you through all of them. Boxing
was televised first.
Boxing really?
Was the first sport to be televised, and a lot of boxing historians blame television for drying up the talent pool. Because it cut down on the number of local shows. Why are you going to go down and watch Joe Schmo when you can turn on the TV and see Joe Louis? So there's that element of it, and I don't know which way to come down on that. There's something to it.
It really is true that you need the northern or northeastern or northwestern European genome to get to the really big sizes, isn't it? Like Brock Lesnar, someone like that. There aren't a lot of Africans who do that.
Big effective sizes. There's things that really gigantic black dudes can do well, but they're mostly pushing sports. They don't do good with lifting or striking. So it's just the way the body supersizes up.
World's Strongest Man, like those types of events.
It's always a Polish guy.
Yeah,
Mario Bujanowski won 6 times.
Yeah, he was so good.
Yeah,
or a Latvian, like Zydrunas Zavikas, that guy.
Yeah, there was
a guy
a
named
Finnish
Rulon
guy
Gardner
for a while.
years ago. I used to know.
There's only been one American that's won it. Kaczmarek.
Bill Kazmir.
Kaczmarek.
Who's the guy who made Kurt Angle? That's what I'm thinking of. He made it from Olympics to wrestling. I never knew of him from the Olympics, just from wrestling, of course, but there's just one American that I know. But yeah, it's usually Eastern European, definitely.
Yeah, and of course you have to a certain extent, you have that body type surviving in this country. And it might be that it's currently dominated by Eastern European because the people in America of that descent have now become, it's just too easy. You can't get somebody to do something like boxing or powerlifting. Powerlifting is one of the most painful things you could ever do. You can't get people to do that stuff unless they're made out of something harder than your orbiting drones.
Or desperate, as you pointed out before.
Right. Yeah,
is it worth it?
You got to grow up in like 1990s Russia to be like hard enough to push it.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of Americans who are quite strong in powerlifting. Like, who's that? Brian Shaw? Is that his name?
Somebody's
6'9".
always placing. And I know somebody's always placing up there. It's God knows we have plenty of genetic material for that sport here. One thing I would like to say before I forget, the thing that I hate about baby boomers the most to do with sports has to do with Muhammad Ali. Okay. When I was growing up, when I was a kid and I was learning how to box, my heroes were the working class black fighters like Joe Frazier. Okay. Dark skinned guys. All right. What Muhammad Ali
I saw a picture of
socially.
Muhammad Ali's mother. She almost looked white. Now it could have been the black and white photo, but I was shocked.
Look at Muhammad Ali compared to Ernie Shavers, compared to Joe Frazier, who he had simian insults to say about, compared to most of the black guys he fought. Okay, and look at how of course, a lot of black dudes were behind Ali because it was one of theirs and he's making good. But the fanaticism behind Ali all came from middle class white people who were just in love with the fact of having Ali as their surrogate beating up a truly frightening looking black man. The guys that Ali beat up were tough Irish and other ethnic white dudes, okay, that no middle-class white guy would ever want to have an argument with. And they were also black dudes that looked like they were right out of prison, dark-skinned guys, were really menacing-looking guys. And Ali beat all of these guys up for all of those sissy white baby boomers sitting at home cheering his name. Okay, and when you rank him objectively according to his accomplishments, he's not even in the top 10. I mean, yeah, he was a great boxer, but the reason why we believe he was the greatest was basically because he's a light-skinned black guy with predominantly Anglo features, making fun of dark-skinned black guys, calling them gorillas, and then beating them up in a scientific manner in which he stays away from them. And the other thing I want you to do, I've seen every one of Muhammad Ali's fights more than once. Muhammad Ali only fought one man who was not taller and larger than him. Muhammad Ali was the big, young guy in almost every fight he was in. Cleveland Williams was 15 years older than him and had been shot. Okay, other guys were 20, 30 years older than him. The only guy that Ali was not bigger than was George Foreman. That was it. He was bigger than everybody else he fought. So when I was a little kid looking at this, to me, Ali was like all the older kids that picked on me and beat me up. I could never look up to him. I like guys like Norton and Joe Frazier, who were like realistically sized human beings.
It's funny you say that because the whole like heavyweight class seems to actually not be fair at all, because the way it works, it's basically just a spillover for people who don't qualify in the lower ranks, which are very similar, in their sort of specifications. But if you get into heavyweight, you've got, Andre the Giant versus a guy who barely covers, the heavyweight classification. So that doesn't seem fair.
There's a sweet spot between 230 and 260 pounds for punching. And that's on a 6 foot to 6 foot 6 inch or 6 foot 6 inch frame. Over 6 foot 6 inches, punching is problematical for the hands because you're going to break your hands too much on heads. And if you get smaller than 6 foot, then you have a hard time reaching certain chins, and the chin is the button. But in that 230 to 260 pounds, 6 foot to 6 foot range, that's where your best boxers are always going to be. They're always going to be able to beat up the giants, and they're always going to be able to exterminate the 220-pound 6'2" dude. Which was like, I liked Evander Holyfield because he was an undersized heavyweight, and he's like an in-your-face heroic type of fighter. He wasn't a runaway and make fun of you kind of guy. So I always that always bothered me about Ali, because the fighters I related with actually mostly were black dudes that were more like somebody I could realistically relate to, because they weren't this towering giant. Like when Ali was the biggest heavyweight of his era, period. You can't even compare him to the other ones. The only man his size, Foreman, was actually a relatively ponderous human being. He made a better, older fighter.
Do you remember their heights?
They were 6'4".
Okay.
That was it. That's as tall as you got back then. Now, you could go back to Jess Willard, 6'7", and the poor Italian circus fighter, Primo Carnera, who almost got killed in the ring by Max Baer. You would have guys suffering from gigantism who could have some success in boxing, but they would without fail suffer these horrific brain-damaging knockouts at the hands of really vicious 5'10" men, like Jack Dempsey.
Wow. For
instance. Jack Dempsey almost killed Jess Willard. It was horrible, and you see that, the stuff that happened to Primo Carnera, for instance. So, size is very often a liability in boxing. In most boxing gyms that have pro or amateur fighters, the top guy is actually around 160 pounds. The guy that beats up everybody in a gym is usually around 160 pounds. And he beats up the heavyweights. He beats up everybody. But you can't let him compete as a heavyweight because he will not be able to sustain the injuries that he will accrue fighting men of that size. Because in combat sports, you're constantly adding up injuries. Most of the heavyweights I fought, I beat as a welterweight, but I injured myself doing it, and it would continually nick away at my sustainability as a functional fighter. So that's not, as far as actually being able to go out there and win. Roy Jones Jr. fought a heavyweight title with John Ruiz and beat the piss out of him. He was giving away 50 pounds. It was a clinic. And Ruiz actually fought intelligently. Ruiz was not a stupid, big galoot type of fighter. Ruiz is the kind of heavyweight that little guys like me are terrified of because he knows how to fight a little man. And Roy Jones Jr. moved up in weight class and cherry-picked him. But the small man cannot sustain himself getting bumped by all those big bodies, because he'll get washed out by injuries. There's a fighter you might want to look up named Young Stribling. He was a light heavyweight. His parents were circus performers. I think they were trapeze artists. He was the all-time knockout leader for about 40 years. He had around 120 knockouts, maybe 125. And he was, they called him the king of the cane breaks. He was some ethnic white kid whose parents were circus performers. I think he died in a car accident. He's a guy who might have been a 180-pound heavyweight champion because he had that kind of punching power, but he got in a car accident. So there's guys you've never heard of in boxing history that just did amazing things.
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's interesting how the media fixates on certain personalities as well. I mean, obviously it's marketing. Who's the most interesting? Who's going to tune in for what? While we got you on here, though, sure. Maybe we could spend some time on some of the other really popular sports. Obviously, we need to cover baseball a little bit just because that was the pastime, and it's transitioned over the years. But let's.
Did I send you the thing on Jim Thorpe?
Yeah, I got it. I didn't have a chance
because
to
he played all those. He played football. He was in the Olympics in track and field, decathlon and pentathlon, and he became the president of the NFL, and he played pro baseball and pro basketball.
Oh, that's kind of cool.
He was.
Remember Bo Jackson? He was doing that too,
French and American Indian. He was just he was an American mongrel. His mother was 1/4 French. His father was half Irish. His American Indian lineage goes back to 3 different tribes, and there's probably some Scotsmen in there somewhere based on his hips.
So at the time, that was not necessarily an asset, I would assume, but today it would probably be one. I don't know what you think. Well, when was he playing? Was this early 20th century kind of thing?
He was born in the late 1870s, early 1880s. He played through the 1920s. He was the most athletic man of his age, period. I mean, and a lot of it has to do with his hip strength, and something that Native American men and Scottish and Irish men have actually long been known for, is having good hips, having strong hips.
This is true. I can attest to this.
What does that mean?
And, so he got that in spades. If you've got for instance, I've got no ass. I've got bad hips. If you're somebody that has tight hamstrings and you have narrow hips, not a narrow waist, but narrow hips, and you don't have much muscle in your buttocks, minor or major, then you're not going to be a judo champion or a wrestling champion, and you're going to be limited in your track and field and football pursuits because the hips are just very important. In fact, in the Odyssey, when Odysseus is described as taking off his beggar's garment and knotting it around his waist, the men in the hall who are betting on him and the other beggar in this ad hoc boxing match, they look at him in amazement at his hip and thigh, about how strong he is between the knees and the waist. And that's something that old hands in any sport look at. Yeah, people that are just spectators tend to look at the waist to shoulder ratio, which does mean something, particularly in throwing sports and punching sports. But old hands in most sports, they want to look at the guy like Cal Ripken that's going to be able to play 7,000 games. You want a guy that's hips are a little bit wider than you would like him for cosmetic purposes if you were a gay fashion designer. Okay. Of course, you want strong shoulders too, but hips are huge. That's when I'm a skinny guy by birth with no butt, but still, even though I had strong shoulders for my size and weak hips for my size, I put more hip into a punch than I put shoulder, because even that little ass is worth more than the cannonball shoulder.
Let me throw you a curveball question, but you're probably one of the few people that I know that might even be able to answer this. What do you think all that comes from? Why do you think those body shapes evolved that way?
We're seeing them mostly out of populations that came from spear hunters. Okay, going way back in Europe, people that hunted megafauna with spears. Okay, you see that in Europe, and in the minority of the African population where you see it, I'm just guessing that it's coming from the same type of population, a group of people
like the Zulus
who had
or somebody.
They had to kill big animals close up. And now when you talk to hunters, any evil little bastard could figure out how to kill an animal. But how are you going to get all that meat home? Okay, you can't even stay there and guard it, really, because you're going to get 40 hyenas on your ass in short order. I talked to these guys out west that hunt. Ishmael tells me you got 20 minutes to bone and gut that thing and chunk it up on the quarters and to swing it over your shoulders and walk out of there before the grizzly bear comes.
Yeah, I was going to say bears are big in the mountains.
So there's always some kind of, there's the lions, for instance. Yeah, if you're a bunch of Bantu guys and you kill this elephant, well, what if a pride of lions is going to come and take this from you? There's 5 of you? Well, yeah, good luck. And you've got spears, you don't have firearms. And if you're looking at Ice Age Europe, that's all you're looking at. All you're looking at is men at close range attriting megafauna and then having to haul that. And when you're looking at the guy that's going to be a good combat infantryman, you're also looking at the same thing. A guy that's got good, strong hips, and he can haul a lot of gear. And the main martial art for the ancient Greek hoplites was wrestling. And their version of wrestling was basically naked judo, and it was all hips. It was basically a hip strength test. And when you've got a bunch of guys, 2,000 to a side, smashing together, if all the guys on one side have strong asses and you've got some bean poles on the other side, the whole thing might fold. Okay. So that hip strength translates into a very important asset for hauling heavy gear and being able to stand up in the battle press. I'll tell you, there's one story where I learned this. I was a skinny twerp that used to beat up heavyweight wrestlers and football players in junior high school. I got into that. I end up at a concert between these two pretty girls. We're waiting outside for 2 hours. It's in July. It's a Boston concert in the Pittsburgh Arena. And somebody kicks down the front door and we start getting sucked in. It was festival seating. Now, I'm a narrow-assed 143-pound guy. I can beat the shit out of this 260-pound guy next to me who's built like, he's built like an offensive lineman. But he just said to himself, he could see what was happening, and he said, fuck this. That's exactly what he said. He had this skinny little girlfriend. He picked her up, and he walked through that crowd. It's like I was like a leaf on the wind. And this guy just walked through that crowd. And, we were basically the same design, but he had strong thighs and hips, and I didn't. I was a calf and upper body guy. And there was a famous champion by the name of Promachus, which means frontline fighter. He fought for the small city of Pellene, which could only field 2,000 men. He won the Olympics in all-power fighting in Pancratium. He was credited with single-handedly rowing up the line of the Corinthian enemy. The Corinthians, they were a major city-state. They should have won this battle. But in hoplite warfare, if you got one guy that's such a superior specimen, and he's got a good, strong lower center of gravity, if he could crash that line and then make a left turn, then he's rolling it up. Because now guys are getting hit square from the side. And they're just getting bowled over like pins, and then the whole thing just starts to fold.
So where I'm kind of
Spartans were beaten by overloading one side, and then they
the Thebans beat them. The Thebans did a 50-to-1 load, and they just steamrolled them.
Right.
The Spartans actually had better men, but the head homosexual from Thebes said, you know what, we're just all going to stack up on this end of the line and run the king over, and that's what they did. Yeah, so you can get the same effect by backloading your guys. Most of the guys in these formations actually have, it's a 20-pound shield. I've used one of these shields before, okay? It's a big bowl that straps onto your arm, and it rests on your shoulder, so your arm doesn't have to hold it up, and you basically slam it into the small of the back of the guy in front of you, and you shove. And you got 16 dudes deep doing this. So yeah, when one line folds, it's a disaster. It's really like a bunch of human bowling pins going down.
This was well described. I think the best description I've read was by Stephen Pressfield in his The Gates of Fire. Yeah. Yeah,
so that was he's actually did the best job on that battle of fiction or nonfiction.
James, I have some questions. I want to get to baseball towards the end, yes, but I wanted to ask. I think we all want to know. What do you think about this NFL, this ongoing NFL drama with the kneeling players and the falling ratings? What do you make of all of it?
Wait! I have a drop. I have to play. Hold on.
Okay. Are you ready for some football? I like it. I think it's great. In Baltimore, I lived under the spectacle of having to walk past the Ravens Stadium to go to work at night while guys are trying to rob me, while the rich white people that live out in Harford County, who all fled Baltimore, take their private buses down to the stadium to watch their pet Negroes terrorize other rich white people's pet Negroes. Okay. And they would, this was a big thing. Ray Lewis became a celebrity icon because he would do this screaming ritual, this angry black man ritual, where he actually, to the humiliation of his entire race, behaves like a baboon. Okay, as a show for these white people that are paying his big money. And this is a statue. This is the only statue in Baltimore that has been protected. Okay, when the Confederate statues were taken down, some rednecks drove into town with a can of purple paint. And after the kneeling thing, when Ray went back on his promise not to kneel and not to support it, these guys went downtown and he threw a can of paint on Ray Lewis's statue. Ray Lewis's statue ever since has had police protection. We actually had police in a city that on one afternoon only had 6 parole officers on duty. On a Saturday afternoon, we had 1 patrol officer assigned to protect Ray Lewis's statue because he's the pet Negro of Central Maryland. Okay.
Yeah, he somehow became like this worship figure. I mean, weren't his stats totally inflated because of the home game record keeping effects and things like that?
Okay, I have some friends that are very big on NFL stats, and they have assured me that he's in the top 20 all-time middle linebacker. Okay, that he is. He's a worthy Hall of Fame guy. But as a linebacker, he doesn't measure up to, let's say, our famous quarterback, Johnny Unitas. Now, Ray Lewis, a friend of mine, who I actually coached in boxing, this is like the last dude in the world you want to meet in an alley. Okay, this guy was a longtime hardcore karate jiu-jitsu guy who learned how to box. He was at a bar where a friend of his bounced. It was an upscale bar in downtown Baltimore. Ray Lewis was there drinking by himself. An older, frail white man asked him for an autograph, and Ray Lewis cussed him out and threatened to beat him up. Okay? This is after the whole town let him off the hook for murdering some other black dude with a knife when he was out with his buddies, okay? Now, my friend's friend, the bouncer, just went up to Ray and pointed to my friend and said, before you open your mouth like that again, Ray, you want to talk to my friend over there. Now, my friend over there is 20 years older than Ray and smaller. And Ray just choked it down. Ray knows a no bullshit white man when he meets him. Okay? He knows his job is to be the pet of all the bullshit white people. Okay? And he knows when not to mess with a real white boy. And he knew it. You know, Ray knows what he is. Ray's a coward. And if you think about it, what's a linebacker? A linebacker is a guy that, you know, he's trying to get around the dangerous dude on the line and smash some twerp that he outweighs by 50 pounds. You know, so it's like, if I could have my revenge.
They're sharks.
Yeah, if I could have my revenge on Ray Lewis, it would be to put him in a fantasy game against Jim Brown in his prime. Just Jim Brown running the ball and Ray Lewis trying to tackle him head to head. And we'd see Ray get run over like 50 times in a row. Now Ray Lewis is a travesty. On the other hand, we had the other type of pet black man situation in Baltimore, Ray Rice, who was my mother's favorite player. My mother's is a Ravens fanatic. She's one of these liberal white people who have their pet black people. And when Ray Lewis supposedly punched out his wife in the elevator, which he did not, he slapped her when she was trying to claw his eyes out, but everybody claims it was a punch, he became persona non grata. And they actually had a jersey give back. You could give back Ray Lewis, or you could give back Ray Rice's jersey. And Ray was not a thug criminal. He had his insane wife who he put in line. He should have laid the Robin Givens pimp slap on her, but he hit her with the Serena Williams pimp slap. You know, so, you know, it happened, and his wife didn't even mind. So
let me just make a pause while that ambulance goes by. That is the third time I've heard one of those in your background, and that just underscores where he's living, and the reality of what he writes is not a joke.
We had the police sirens earlier today. For now, it's just ambulances. But Ray Rice is actually a decent black dude. He wasn't a thug black dude like Ray Rice. Because he slapped his insane wife and put her back in line, all of the white women in Maryland turned on him, and they went to Raven Stadium, and they're giving back their jerseys. Not one black person got up and gave back their Ray Rice jersey. Okay, and this was a few years ago. That's when I saw the split in the NFL, because the big push for the NFL was expanding middle-class white female viewership. They already had all the white and black dudes locked down they were going to have. Okay, they're going for this middle-class white viewership, and
that's what Tom Brady's all about.
Yeah, they tripped. That's right. They stepped on their dick right there with the Ray Rice thing. That's the way I saw it, at least.
What do you think about OJ? I mean, he was even dating and marrying a white
killed
woman.
A middle-class white woman.
Well,
I'm sure that did really well for the
there's an important aspect here. Okay, why do you think you have a pet apex predator black man like Ray Lewis being worshipped by all these white people? Okay, because he makes them feel that I don't have OJ, I have Ray. Ray would protect me from a mugger, for heaven's sake.
No,
that's what they're thinking.
What it is absolution. They want to get rid of the original sin of being white. That's what it is. Because I have a pet Negro, so I'm not racist.
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I think there's different levels of it there, but at a certain extent, I know white people in Baltimore that will talk to white people in Pittsburgh and say, "Oh, our black NFL players we have more convicted felons on our team than you have on your team," and they're actually proud of it.
I think it's beyond pathetic.
But I feel
for
like
white people, not for black people, but for white people to be worshiping these African people who clearly don't respect them. And if you look at the take a knee thing, and it goes beyond that with all the crime that's committed. You want to talk about the NBA for a minute? This pardon that Trump gave to these thugs that went over to China and stole some stuff, and Trump actually has to go through the top channels of the Chinese government to get these guys off the hook, and then their father, one of the guys' fathers, insults Trump after the fact.
Yeah.
It's just beyond how much more bending over does there need to be done for people to just stand up for themselves, and that's all. And people will respect that. But I think black people probably see white people acting like this, and it encourages them to feel the way they do, and they probably look down upon that behavior. I wouldn't respect any race who behaves that way about themselves. I mean, it's really a captive. It's like a Stockholm syndrome behavior almost.
When you talk to older black guys, they actually blame a lot of the black youth interracial crime on these sissy white people, that actually are like this. I used to go to this one bar where, it's...
Well, they let them get away with shit that they should never have gotten away with at a very young age. And then
right. and
that's when it starts.
A friend of mine, that he's basically the alpha male at a mixed race bar. He's a black guy. He takes it upon himself to make sure that all of the white patrons make it safely to their car because he knows young men of his race are preying on them. And he blames this fact on the fact that most white people deny that it's a fact, and they make excuses for these young black criminals, and they also don't believe that they should even protect themselves and that the police should do it and everything. And it's this whole complex. It drives them crazy. The other bar I go to, Big Ron, is basically the alpha male there, and he'll do the same thing. Are you okay? Do you need to walk to your car? He doesn't want it to happen. So there's in Malaysia, they used to have this thing called running amok, and they would have these. They have these Y-shaped sticks in the village. When a young man would go crazy and start killing people, the elders would all pin him to the tree with this Y-shaped thing. We actually have, in that segment of our population, a large portion of these guys, 30% of them, are running totally amok. And there's no idea that you should pin them to the tree with a Y-shaped stick, but that you should actually make excuses for them running amok and doing stuff to people. And, actually, the older black dudes I know, they've given up. They can't combat it. They're hanging out with me and Ron at the next bar up the road. Because
I've met some pretty cool
young criminals.
I've met some pretty cool older black people, and you can reason with them, and there's a certain understanding there. It just seems lost today. I mean, it's like almost like the people have divided more.
So those dudes aren't going to be there 20 years from now. There's not going to be reasonable older black dudes out there. So that's the real interesting point for me down the road when you get to that. And one basketball story I have I actually did. I never played basketball before. I was playing basketball with these two really big white boys next to this factory, and I finally made a basket. And as I made the basket, 15 of these black dudes come over the hill. They see me make this basket from half court, and then they decide to pick up sides. The big white guy and the big black guy pick up sides, and I'm the first pick of the big black guy because he saw me made that basket. But then I ask him, after he gets everybody together and he tells us what to do, I looked at him and I said, well, I got a question. He said, what's that? I said, what are the rules? He's like, what? I said, I never played this game before. These guys were just showing me how to throw a basket. He said, blood under the net. That's the rules. Blood under the net. You make sure nobody gets the ball back under the net. You eat blood under the net. Well, I accidentally knocked the only dude on the court that was shorter than me, I accidentally knocked him out with an elbow because we were both reaching for the same rebound under the net. and I knocked this guy out cold. And the two white dudes that were there were these two suburban white dudes. They both looked at me, and you could tell they were waiting to get executed. And then my team captain came up to me and slapped me on the back. He said, "That's what I'm talking about. Got a real Negro here. First blood under the net."
Oh,
so, but the other basketball thing is, I interviewed a guy who went into the U.S. military rather than do prison time because he was attending a university where a basketball star, a black guy, was in the process of raping a female student. He was a boxer. He stopped the rape in progress. He seriously injured the basketball player, and the basketball player was not prosecuted for the rape in progress, but this man was prosecuted for actually assault with a deadly weapon.
How the hell did that happen? Wasn't the woman willing to testify?
The player was very important to the alumni. This is one of these guys.
See, this is where it really disgusts me, because all these jackasses who support, their school because they want their team to win. I mean, you fucking kidding me?
Tom Wolfe.
It was about rich white men getting the player they wanted, and they're willing to sacrifice this girl. And this dude, ironically, the judge tells him, this was long enough ago. This was back in the 90s. This was back in the 90s. This was long enough ago where he could give him an ultimatum and send him to the army. So he ends up going into the army, and when he gets out, he becomes a military contractor, and he's shooting black dudes in the Congo a couple of years ago. So eventually he ends up doing the same thing he was going to do anyhow, right? Because I think
he asked for that assignment. He wasn't.
Right. I think what he did is this, he's a lot smaller than this guy, so I think he beat him up with a phone or something like that. Took a phone receiver and beat his face in or something like that.
Oh, back when phones were actually sizable.
Right, so it became this weapons charge, even though it's this 5'10" guy beating up this 7-foot guy, who's actually got his penis inside of this woman. Okay. So
I would have loved to be in that courtroom and testified on behalf of him. Just for half a second, just to be able to light into this guy who was raping a woman, and to call him what he is basically a fucking pussy. He can't behave himself. He can't control his dick, and he actually has to drag the entire school in to defend him, and he's taking advantage of a helpless woman, ruins a guy's life. What the hell kind of a coward, dishonorable piece of garbage are you? That's what I would have said.
And that's exactly, you framed it morally, just as it was. And, the man that told me about this, it did, he got through it. He's a tough man, tough Irish guy, but he went through numerous hells that most of us probably can't imagine during his military service.
And then I'd also like to get that fucking school, and sue them for this, because they're responsible for this crap. And this is not just an isolated incident. There was I don't know if it was Duke, but there was some team that was raping, a gang rape of these women, and they did the same shit. They tried to cover it up because they're these star players.
They were advertising to the players, we got plenty of young, fit, white teenage cheerleaders for you.
Christ, it's like Rotherham,
to have your way with if you come join our team.
Tommy Sotomayor did a program on this, a couple programs on this, actually.
He's great. I like him. Yeah.
Look, the one thing I would like to say is basketball was reprehensible. I would firebomb every basketball court there is. It's just there's no redeeming it. But it's a non-contact sport to begin with, and so to me it's got no value. But I think we do have something salvageable in baseball, just because of the fact that the fan situation at the baseball park here, where I live, has never gotten to be ghettoized. It was the Baltimore Orioles fans were actually attacked by the rioters and fought back. And the players, the black players and the mixed race players that we have on this Baltimore Orioles team, they're all good guys. They behave according to a Caucasian behavioral standard. And they actually, and part of it has to do with how much work they have to put in to even make this team. I knew a black fellow who played for a minor league team for 13 years. I actually walked him home because he was afraid other black people were going to rob him. He was a fine physical specimen, could have been a middleweight contender as a boxer, but he made $40,000 a year for about 13 years playing for a AAA team. He was a perfect gentleman. And baseball did not play into his lowest common denominator or his lesser angels. Football does, though. In football, you're just a moving piece. You're something. You're like a round of ammunition that gets plugged into the, to the team ammo belt. And there's just something that's, I think, as much as it mimics our mechanized society as a sport, I think it ends up having a lot of the same problems morally.
James, are you at all familiar with the weird history that the NFL has with gambling and the sort of Judaic Italian mafia on the East Coast?
I have no idea about this. I'd like to hear about this.
So I was doing some last-minute research last night and came across a San Diego Reader book review of a book called Interference: How Organized Crime Influences Professional Football by Dan Moldia. And it basically goes into the history of, actually it was Al Capone's mob got one of their starts in investing with a guy named Bidwill, Charles Bidwill. He was a bootlegger and a gambler, and just sort of a mob guy, into the Chicago Cardinals, and that became the Arizona Cardinals. And that family, the Bidwill family, which is a mafia family, still owns the Cardinals as of this book. There was another guy, Tim Mara, who was a mob guy. He bought the New York Giants. It's still controlled by his family. I think the two actresses, Rooney and Kate Mara, they are the descendants of that line, I'm pretty sure.
That's fascinating.
Of sports ownership. You had a lot more of these guys: Art Modell, Sam Giancana, Vincent Allo, the Rams, the Raiders, the Chargers. A lot of major NFL teams were owned or were started or were predominantly run at sort of the middle level by guys who were in deep with the Italian mafia back in Vegas and in Atlantic City in Jersey. And the article was also going into just how much money is dropped on NFL gambling and sports gambling. Like it's at least $100 billion some years in terms of just sports gambling in the United States.
I had no idea.
And a lot of it.
But is that the legitimate portion, or it includes all the sort of side betting?
That's all of it. Oh, that's all of it. That's including illegal and illegal. But the majority of that, and that's a conservative estimate, but the majority of that is very illegal.
As far as illegal money, the only thing I've heard about ball sports, there's a gentleman who shopped, he bought yogurt for me every night for about 5 years. He's a tall black fellow who played professional basketball for the Baltimore Bullets way back in the day. His son they moved to Italy. His son now plays on a professional team in Italy. And he told me that he was not thrilled about his son getting involved in college athletics because he knew for a fact that there was a lot of drug money that was given to lawyers that worked as defense attorneys for different gangs in Baltimore that found its way to alumni in American colleges, who would then make sure that a young fellow that had pro prospects who would make their school look good would then get a position playing ball. He wanted his son to actually get an education when he was in college because he knew he wasn't going to be the next Michael Jordan. And he was, so he did tell me that, according to him, that there is illegal drug money that feeds the college alumni funds for star basketball players.
No, that wouldn't surprise me at all. Not one bit.
That's all I've ever heard of it.
On
I
the
just don't
subject
get
of
it.
baseball,
I don't know how grown men could actually find watching these morally and intellectually stunted people hit each other on a field and be comfortable with the fact that these people are basically barbarians raping and making a mockery of the educational aspects of what a school is supposed to be. And they're also running drugs, as it turns out. I mean, I really get angry at this stuff because these.
I'll take a shot at it.
Yeah, please.
Okay, if we get back to the tribal nature of ball sports, okay, these are now our surrogate tribes. If you look at the names for baseball teams, it's bucolic. It represents an easy day at the park. When you look at the name of a baseball team, when you look at the name of a football team, it's some kind of predatory war motif or American Indian motif, and so on. It's a surrogate tribe. We're a society where nobody has a tribe, and you've got the people that are most atomized are the managerial functionaries, who the people that act nuts the most. When I watch football with my brother-in-law and my uncle broke a dude's leg in a baseball game at Texas A&M back in the 50s. He coached football for VMI, for Army he coached. Sitting next to him and watching it, he's very sober, and he will technically explain things to me. And he'll give me scouting reports on these different guys. And it's interesting because he understands how these moving pieces work. But my brother-in-law, who never played football, he's jumping up and down spilling his Cheetos. So it's a way.
It's so funny because I have this in my family. It's like these very intelligent men who then turn into these. I mean, I get worked up over like actual events. I wish they would, but they get more excited about what's on the fucking television with these black guys, throwing balls at each other. I just don't. I never understood.
The counterpart in the ancient world, okay, is not the gladiatorial games. It's the circus. The circus is the racetrack. The Circus Maximus, where they used to run the chariots. This was so effective at controlling crowds. Even after the Roman Empire became Christianized and split in two, the Greek Orthodox Roman Empire maintained chariot racing teams.
The hippodrome.
Okay? Right. They didn't have a problem with it because, one, it was kind of like rollerball, where the actual driver is a slave. He's not, he might become a hero for a moment, but he's going to get run over and get his legs cut off sooner or later. He's a piece of meat. It's really owned by a concern. Most of our scholars they draw parallels with the gladiatorial combat, but that was an altogether different thing. That was actually a way people in Rome got to eat meat. Okay, they would mainly go to those things because they could actually get some meat once a year and eat a little bit of meat, because the animals that were killed in the arena would be cooked up and fed to the spectators. And the gladiators that died, if they didn't have enough money for their funeral fund, would get killed, would actually be fed to the animals, some of the animals. So you would actually have this like cannibalistic chain of events that went on there, which is pretty disgusting. But the Romans they eventually used gladiatorial combats like they used the Circus Maximus as a distraction. But the Circus Maximus was a distraction from day one. And that's how it was designed, okay, was just to get people focused on actually being mentally behind the team. Because if the people have nothing, if they've got no association that means anything, then all you have to do is let them say that that's my team.
This makes me wonder if the NFL teams will be used as a basis for Civil War factions. As the blues and the greens in Constantinople were used in a civil war that Justinian and Theodora crushed.
That would be great. But I don't think it's not much of a stretch, especially if the people never played ball sports. Because the people that act like the biggest jerks here and get most vested in it, they're the guys that didn't play in high school or college. Okay, like, for instance, my brother, okay, he actually played sports at a high level. He couldn't turn pro because he ruined his knees. He was in the 82nd Airborne, and he was a big Pittsburgh Steelers fan. He will never watch another NFL game again because Pittsburgh Steelers sanctioned that Army veteran.
Was he in Grenada?
He was in Vicenza, Italy when the Grenada operation was going on. So he knew a couple of guys that actually got killed in Grenada.
Yeah, I know the 82nd were in that. I know some guys who were in that.
He told me a scary story about getting loaded on a tarmac in Vicenza, and they were going to drop him into Lebanon after the Marines got greased in the barracks explosion. Okay. And he just said that was terrifying. You know, they were just like, they were actually going to parachute into Lebanon, and they were actually taxiing down the one-way when they called him off. But he'll never watch another ball game again. He can make that decision. Okay. When my brother-in-law said he never watched another football game again, because he was also a veteran, he went back on it the next week because he wasn't an athlete. He didn't actually put the time in on the ball field.
Yeah, it doesn't speak to exactly like the effort and the discipline that's required when you're truly trying to hone your body and your mind to something like as difficult as competitive professional sports, especially.
Yeah, so I think it's our society is not that our society needs these team sports. I think our society is set up to make sure that the individual yearns for one of two things. Either this false group association that's going to be harnessed by the celebrity mind control machine, or they're just going to become drug addicts. You know, and that also feeds into the other part of the economy.
Well, James, I wanted to get your take on, I guess, kind of close it out on baseball. Baseball is one of the more genuinely American sports. Unfortunately, Nick is not on today. Otherwise, he would remind everyone that baseball is actually a giant Masonic ritual. That I guess many of the original pioneers of baseball were all Masons, and there's a lot of esoteric masonry to the whole thing. But
it makes sense because it's obviously, I'm just saying that it has an aristocratic origin.
Oh, yeah.
By the rules, okay? Yeah. Because it's like golf in that it's very pedestrian, it's very sedate, and there's these very specific goals. That speaks to something like croquet or cricket or golf.
Yeah, I mean, and, you know, one of the things I've always found strange with baseball is how complex the let's say the behind the scenes of baseball's become. Not just the trading and the management of baseball and the management of the franchises is really complicated, and it's more complicated than most sports. But just the math behind a lot of playership and a lot of the game itself is sort of unique. Everyone, maybe a lot of people have heard of sabermetrics, which is sort of it's more akin to fan league math, but it's actually used in real life. This stuff goes back to the 70s. There's a Society for American Baseball Research, or SABR, and you had guys like Bill James. Bill James is a kind of quirky character. He is sort of the main genius behind sabermetrics and a lot of the statistical analysis of baseball. He wrote the Bill James baseball abstract in the early 80s. And he developed, like hundreds and hundreds of pages of ways to analyze baseball and ways to develop data-driven strategies. And all of it was devoid of kind of star baseball. You if you followed the Bill James approach, you would never have a Babe Ruth because you were just maximizing ways to achieve certain goals, and the main goal of baseball is to achieve runs. Then you had guys like
well, if I can comment real quick.
Yeah.
So you mentioned Babe Ruth. I believe he has, to this day, at least he did in his day, the all-time slugging percentage record. And the way that works, it's more than like batting averages. It's like a formula, and I'll just read it out just to prove my second point, which is slugging average or slugging percentage equals 1B plus, and this is in parentheses, 2 times 2B plus 3 times 3B plus 4 times home runs over AB, which is at bats. And look it up if you're curious, but basically my point is that the amount of effort that actually is put into this tells me two things. One, you actually get something out of it, and two, it really is kind of like an autiste sport. I mean, it's crazy, and so you don't have these huge personalities. Ironically, Babe Ruth, is like the record holder, but it's true that the Moneyball movie probably demonstrates this most clearly in a succinct fashion. But you really do have to try to look at this holistically, not individualistically. And it's interesting also that the turn-based nature of the game allows for this. Because if you look at, even in football, you do have turns, but like basketball, for example, like there's no turns. It's very chaotic. Right. So you can never really apply this level of mathematical order to it, because it just would never happen again. I mean, there's just so many chaotic, random events happening all at once. You couldn't really put as much mathematics into it. But with baseball, it's very turn-based, very slow, and so you can do this. So it's kind of interesting how that evolved based on
the math aspect goes back well over 100 years. Like you have guys like FC Lane, who came up with the concept of batting averages, and came up with a lot of statistical methods of analyzing offensive baseball maneuvers and how to determine not always strategy, but how to just analyze a lot of baseball. And then you had Alan Roth, which is evaluating player performance in the 60s. And then you have another guy, Earl Weaver. He was the guy with the index cards and the pitching changes strategies and a lot of the statistical analysis. That was in the 60s. Like it goes back and back. And the Michael Lewis book, Moneyball, which is where the story of Billy Beane and the Oakland A's comes from. And they made it into a movie with Brad Pitt, but that kind of is a microcosm of this big data meets sports. So I wanted to know, James, if you think that if it makes sports more cynical, like as data becomes more available, like there's something called Retro Sheet, which has every data point you would ever want on any game ever played, going back to the early 50s until now. So over 200,000 baseball games played at major league level. Do you think that kind of draws out the excitement and sort of the rigor of just being a good ball player?
I would go beyond that and say that you have similar trends in other sports to a lesser degree. This is the one that lends itself the most to it. You have a continual expansion and deepening of the role played by the manager. Yeah. And a lessening of the importance of the role played by the individual. It's inherently anti-heroic. This is why the people in the high ancient civilizations would think we were insane for having ball sports as a focus of our culture. Because all of these sports, what they do by different increments and different ways is they minimize the heroic potential in the event.
There's a scene, and the Michael Lewis book, Moneyball, is a good book. Michael Lewis is a good author, but if you don't want to read the book,
I saw the movie. I enjoyed the movie.
The movie does a good job of capturing the book, which is true to life of the behind-the-scenes work, not just on the statistical side, but of just general management. And Billy Beane and he's kind of like a mix of talent agent from Hollywood and used car salesman. And the way, and you're right, it's anti-heroic, like the way that he is wheeling and dealing players and firing and hiring people 3 or 4 times over the course of the same day, or sometimes the same 2 hours, is pretty remarkable.
If you look at it, our modern sports, if we look at these two big ones, baseball and football, these are almost like Newtonian fantasies with a clockwork god that manages everything. And you're trying not to get squished between the gears, or you're trying to be the right brand of grease for this tooth on this gear right now.
Yeah.
And it would totally not relate to somebody who had had a heroic ideal, or had an idea that you would be subject to fickle fates and a real meaningful sport would be one where something, where there would be occasions where things could not be figured out, where it would be up to a person to react or act and take the right response. I would say one thing that I'm looking into, and I'm not sure on it yet, we have these various sports with goals, the goal post, the goal net, okay? The place where runaway servants, which is sometimes what white slaves were called, the place where they were kept before they were auctioned off and sold again or returned to their owner in England and in America, was called a goal, Gaol. Most of the period sources, because the spelling was not uniform, would actually invert the vowels and misspell it like we would spell goal, like a football goal.
Mm-hmm.
That was the meaning of goal before all these really stylized ball sports came into being. I'm wondering if there's any way the semantics from being the guy whose job it was to collect these runaway Irish kids and lock them up in the goal, if there's any way where that semantics got into, the scorekeeping. The basically you're usually throwing the ball into a net or whatever. It's some kind of thing that looks like it could be a pen or a cage where you keep people in. So it's just something that I've wondered about. But there's no uniformity to the spelling of it. But I think it's all the big managed team sports. I think they're all cynically seductive to get the person who's strapped into a materialistic system to keep pedaling on that hamster wheel. Because they feel like there's somebody that's pedaling on their own hamster wheel. Because your heroes are actually constrained to this very, in the end, anything an athlete does, the umpire or referee can undo it. It could get overturned, by the, after the TV replay or whatever. I just think that that it's a high level form of hypnotism, and that you fellas are not subject to this form of hypnotism for some reason.
I think it's personality. I've never liked sports. I never knew why until I got older, but I'll ask this to the other co-hosts, why you guys think you've never really been drawn to it. And maybe I'm mishearing it, but it sounds like you guys are fairly similar.
Well, I broke through it. I was initially not drawn to it, but then I became a complete slave to the NFL, to the point where I had memorized Eddie George's average rushing yards and his total rushing yards, all these things, and all these other players. I knew all these statistics. But then I began to study economics, and I understood that the NFL was economics and anthropology, and I understood what the NFL was, that it was just a mechanism for hijacking my primal desires and in a commercially profitable way. And then I became repulsed by it, horribly repulsed.
Yeah, I would say that I broke through it as well. I mean, I was my formative years in elementary school and in middle school, I was a huge baseball kid. Once I got old enough, it was fall ball and spring ball and sometimes all-star teams. It drove my schedule every week, and I got really into it. And eventually, it just sort of became disillusioned with it. I didn't want it to be my identity was just baseball player, and it became a huge time sink. And eventually, once I learned more and more about the behind the scenes of baseball, it was interesting from, as Alex is saying, maybe an economics and anthropological perspective, but it ruined the mystique of baseball for me. It ruined a lot of the fun. Although sometimes, the only way I can still have fun with it is just to go to the batting cages for an hour. But outside of that, I think that the analytics approach to sports in this huge way is ruining it for a lot of American kids.
So hearing you guys say that you maybe regret or you no longer have an interest in this, I wonder if I would say I'm happy for you, because as a guy who's never found an interest in sports and never really understood why people do like it, it's nice to hear other people who can understand where I'm coming from. But It makes me wonder couple things. One, would I be happier? Would you guys be happier if you just basically just fit in with everybody else? Because I find myself being frustrated on Thanksgiving, for example, when people are sitting in front of this giant television, and I'd rather just talk to people. I mean, I thought that was the whole point of getting together. But the other thing is, like, what the hell? Why am I like this? I mean, and you guys are a little bit different in that you sort of have gotten away from it, but it seems like you were attracted to it at one point, but I never was. And for me, I can kind of try to guess is that my personality being very kind of serious is I would probably be like the guy evolution would have selected to be the night watchman. Like, I'm basically the guy who's like making sure that somebody's not breaking the wall down, you know, but I'm not exactly like the most, I mean, I could sort of hold court at a party, but I'm usually there to sort of find interesting people, not just have fun. I'm usually there for a reason. And so I think I would fill a different role in the past, and today it's just sort of a question of what sort of how that fits into society. But I'll stop talking. What do you guys think about the anthropology of it all?
Why that screen is there that's distracting your family from socializing with you? Is it there to just occupy them and keep you on the outside? Or maybe if that screen wasn't there, maybe that keeps you out of the center. Maybe you're the person that would start a conversation with the wisest person in the room, the oldest person in the room, and ask them about something. And then other people would listen, and then things would gel together. People would start learning about their uncle or their granddad. So it might not be a sign that you're the oddball. It might be the sign that you're the man that was meant to be. And the screen is there to repel you and to keep you on the outside. And the best you can do is hope you run into a cousin or somebody that's also repelled by this.
That means a lot to me. And yeah, that's usually what happens. I'll usually find somebody off in a corner that seems more interesting to me.
I'm saying that's the default. I do it too. That's where we go. But maybe that's not the purpose. Maybe the purpose is making sure you're not in the middle. You're not the guy there talking to the wisest old lady or the sharpest, middle-aged guy.
Yeah.
It's there to break down bonds in that sense. It's there to prevent an American, well, let's not say Hezbollah, but something like that maybe.
Well, actually, like caring about a real struggle rather than something that's trivial, wouldn't that be an innovation on our society, rather than watching Dancing with the Stars?
I was never really. Sorry.
No, that's it. I mean, I just you got it. Let's go ahead.
I was never really on either side of the team sport thing. I was forced to play a season of football and 2 seasons of baseball when I was a little kid. Eventually, I was recruited to play football for 2 seasons because I agreed that it would be fun to hurt people. What really killed me on team sports was I had a soccer coach, my brother's soccer coach, try to recruit me as a hitter. He wanted me to just stay on the sideline, and then when there was a fight, because my brother started a lot of fights because he would intentionally make people foul him so he could get penalty shots, and he was an excellent penalty shooter. He wanted me to come off the sideline and break feet. And, I was a savage little kid, but I was like, you know what? This is really wrong. There's nothing good about team sports. If this is what it is. It was one thing to get attacked by this Puerto Rican dog and its 2 Puerto Rican owners when I was waiting for my mom to pick me up after baseball practice, or to have the first baseman beat me up every day because I was the shittiest left fielder after practice. That was one thing. But then when I became a teenager and I saw that these adults who were people that I knew I wouldn't respect as an adult because they were teachers, okay, they're actually socializing with children, that they would use children for such nefarious purposes just to win a game, or just to be the coach that wins the award for the season. So that was that's what did it for me for team sports. As far as individual sports, I did as much as I could do. I have usually been hated when I was in a big fight. I recall the thrill of having 500 people cheer for me to get knocked out in 2009 in Norfolk, Virginia, when I was fighting Damian Kessel. And I felt okay after he slapped an armbar on me, after he supleed me, and all 500 people got up and cheered. I was like, okay, that was my role. I was okay with that. Yeah. He had to work hard to do me in. So I see him as two totally different things. I largely see team sports as the spectacle, the mechanism of the spectacle, hijacking a tribal pastime that's supposed to be for group bonding and using it to replace the sacred Aryan rituals of the past. Okay, and it's scoring a lot of it's doing a lot of destruction at the same time.
Yeah,
it's hijacking a couple of things.
Yeah, I think that's very well put. And if I can sort of bring this to a close, I'd like to say, as sort of a call to anyone who's listening, I'm assuming mostly men, get back in touch with the sort of heroic elements of what the athletics was really about. And if you look at the Olympics, it's ultimately about the man against the struggle against himself and also for his own people. And these large mass spectacles, as James eloquently puts it, just don't represent anything real anymore. And so get back in touch with being a man.